Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. And for some ungodly reason, you still have the boredom to watch this show. Welcome to the 10th episode of the World So Far Report. As always, alongside with me, it's my colleague Victor Kreinik.
Shalom Aleichem.
Alrighty, so it's been a while. Well, actually, it hasn't been that long since the previous video, because I've already published an interview with the Romanian revolutionary and documentarian Marius Miuc. First of all, we remind you that the show exists solely because you support it, so please give shekelim so it won't cough, so this show won't cough to death and get permanently quarantined. If you want to curse at us or send us news or, God forbid, to praise us, topics@freedomalternative.com. We're also on BitChute. Don't forget to subscribe on our profile there as well, because you never know when big tech decides to be stupid in public. All right, this is going to be a difficult episode to tape.
Yes, we're definitely going to discuss what we actually didn't miss last time. It's just that when we recorded it, it was already happening in DC.
It had not happened yet, because when we were done taping, it was still very early in the morning in DC, so yeah. It had not happened yet, so nobody can comment events that have not happened yet. On top of that, obviously we see a slow return to normal. One example to that is that I caught the flu. So there's going to be very heavy editing in this episode while I stop to perform the great ritual of, what does Miguel call it? The great sneeze forward. I'm looking forward for this very cold weather to get flattened a little bit so I can travel to Miguel's so we can tape another episode of the occasional podcast where I'm gonna have him talk about the great sneeze forward. Anyway, so yeah, let's talk about more capital insurrection. Is there anything really to be said? I guess first of all, let's dismiss the whole nonsense peddled by the cathedral media. Oh my God, unprecedented insurrection! Yeah, wah. Okay, there is a chap sitting now at the Supreme Court. His name is Brett Kavanaugh. People might have forgotten that it's only been like 2 years and 4 months or so. In September 2018, lots and lots of leftists poured into the Capitol building whilst the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh were taking place. And they tried really, really hard to disrupt it in an attempt to prevent Brett Kavanaugh from being confirmed to the Supreme Court, roughly in the same vein, with the belief that if they disrupt it enough, then maybe it won't happen, right? 128 people were arrested at the biggest protest at the Capitol Hill. How many of them got arrested on January the 6th following? 100? Something even less than that.
Yeah, so somewhere in the hundreds.
No. So yeah, what I'm saying is that, massive amounts of people, not massive, hundreds, or maybe 1,000 people storming into the Capitol is not really an exceptional event. Yeah, sure, it doesn't happen every day, but just in the last decade alone, it happened 5 or 6 times. So, it's neither very common, but also neither very rare. It's a very traditional way of doing politics. At some point, one faction, usually the left, I guess what's exceptional is that the right hasn't been doing this since, I guess, 2008 or 2009, something like that. So it's been a while since the right has been doing it, so maybe that's somewhat exceptional. Usually the left pulls in these kinds of temper tantrum.
Yeah, my issue is just as you said, that the last time it happened was a bit over 2 years ago, and I'm not sure if it's again the short memory span of people of not remembering what happened back then, but also how much they swallowed the cathedral media propaganda on what exactly happened.
Yeah, I think I just watched today a conversation that took place a few days ago between Eric Weinstein and I believe it was Glenn Beck. For those who don't know, Glenn Beck is a conservative and Eric Weinstein is a non-insane progressive. So they kind of fit together to talk to each other. And Eric Weinstein was noting that, look, for all intents and purposes, the Capitol Hill protests on January the 6th were mostly peaceful.
Exactly.
I mean, if the BLM riots were mostly peaceful, then this one was mostly peaceful as well. Nothing was burned to the ground. 5 fatalities, which by BLM standards is again mostly peaceful. A couple hundred arrests, which by Capitol Hill protest standards is within the historical norm, even the recent historical norm, not to mention the historical norm over a longer span of time. I mean, if we're talking about the storming of the Capitol Hill in 1968, the one on January the 6th, 21 was not even child's play. So I'm just saying. But yes, from Europe it looked a lot worse than it actually was. Because in Europe, at least in Western Europe, it's very rare to see this happening. Although here in Eastern Europe, it's a little bit more common. We kind of burn governments to the ground occasionally. Most recently, I believe it was in Bosnia in 2016. 2009 in Republic of Moldova, where they burned the parliament down. We kind of do these things sometimes. Of course, Maidan protests in Ukraine and subsequent protests. Most people forget that after the conclusion of the so-called Maidan revolution, there are several other protests that had a very similar outcome, with parliamentarians taken out by force and thrown into the trash bin. That's also not uncommon in Ukrainian politics. From Eastern Europe, that's why we looked at it very, very calmly, because we're like, oh, look, the Americans are just doing politics for a while, just like kind of we do it. Sometimes happens. Sometimes a certain faction of the electorate gets pissed off over something. It doesn't even have to be something serious. It just have to be pissed off. This time around it was a serious topic, but it could have been something non-serious, like structural oppression, like it happened last time, which is something not serious. But these kinds of things happen. Yes, sure. From Western Europe, it's a little bit more rare. Although recently I've seen the protests in Den Haag, or was it Amsterdam? It was in the Netherlands for sure, where the police used horses to stomp on protesters' heads. And this happened just like last week in the Netherlands, right? So it's not really.
I think that was in Amsterdam.
I don't remember whether it was Den Haag or Amsterdam, but the point is that these kinds of things happen even in Western Europe a lot more often. Yeah, sure, it does. The English language press doesn't write about it. That's one of the privileges of speaking multiple languages. Anyway, I've written here a few other events in the recent decade. Just for links in the low bar. Read the news reports yourself. Very mainstream, center leftish sources. So April 2016, about 400 people were arrested at another storming of the Capitol Hill. Obama was president. And then look up the protests at the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin, against Scott Walker's spending bill. It was an austerity bill. Those protests lasted for almost 2 years, with multiple instances between 2011 and 2013. The protesters occupying the Capitol building, the rotunda as they call it. The building itself had to be put under lockdown multiple times between 2011 and 2013. Nobody fainted then, and nobody pearl clutched. Oh my God, the democracy is falling, we're never... Give me a break. In 2016, it happened actually twice. There was another igloo in Washington over so-called police brutality. In July 2016, another 200 people were arrested then, also under Obama.
Also under Obama,
And of course, in 2018, as I said, during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. And that's just the biggest protests that I was able to remember last night at 4 a.m. when I was doing the file for this episode. I'm sure there are many others. And this is just the last 20 years and just the bigger ones.
It's a bigger one, and the reason why it was so much in the spotlight of the press, and it was also mentioned.
It was a slow news day.
It was definitely a slow news day. The only reason why it got capitalized by absolutely everybody, not just the press, but also the Democrats and everybody else, and why it was so discussed, is that this time it wasn't other leftists like it happened twice under Obama, or some other people, or something considered by other people irrelevant, just like the lockdown in the rotunda in Madison. but this time it was Trump's fault. And I've seen a lot of absolutely bonkers conspiracy theories. There was one 2-minute video that I've seen. I'm not sure what's the guy's name, Dan Winslow or something like that. He posted a video of how after the 20th of January, the Trump will become the Supreme Commander of the Trump Army. Those guys that were on the 6th of December, so on the 6th of January. Yeah.
Yeah, it's January the 21st. That didn't happen. I'm just saying. Hold on a second. I forgot another example. The 2016 protests at Sacramento Capitol in California. 5 or 6 people were stabbed. Very similar with again, California under Obama. Nobody made a huge fuss about it. It was nothing special. It's the kind of bigger protest that occurs roughly every 2 years, if we're being honest, because the 2021, 2018, 2016, 3 or 4 times, 2014, 2011 to 13. Roughly every 2 years, some kind of a small igloo like this kind of tends to happen. You're right. One of it was that it could be framed as, oh, this is Trump's fault, but also because it was a slow news day. I mean, if you're looking, again, with the statistical norm, use DuckDuckGo or Google or whatever search engine you want, and look it up, news feeds between January the 5th and January the 7th in English for the last 20 years. And you'll notice a pattern. Every time, every single year around that period, it's a very slow news day, and it's all sorts of irrelevant tosh is being very seriously, in all seriousness, discussed because there's nothing to talk about, because January the 5th, January the 6th, January the 7th, that's usually the period when there is in some countries of the world is Christmas, the Eastern Orthodox Christmas, and in the countries that work under the Western calendar, they've just gotten over the Christmas and New Year's Eve holidays. Most people don't have any mood to work.
They just woke up in the first week of the new year. Again, recovering from the New Year parties and everything. What exactly was going to happen?
And add to that, of course, the psychopathologies having been accelerated this time around. There are more insane people now than on January the 6th, 2020, or January the 6th, 2019, or even January the 6th, 2017 at Trump's inauguration. There was just, and I mean, maybe I'm a bit harsh, not necessarily insane, but mentally vulnerable people. Well, that's what I mean,
I've seen this mental vulnerability also. I've used the previous example with that guy posting this amazing conspiracy theory that Trump will become the supreme commander of a new army of citizens. But there are also significant slippages also on the other side of the barricade, launching a lot of sensational fan fiction. The most recent one was how actually Trump will be some sort of shadow president behind Biden or something like that. There was also some discussion regarding the reason why Trump didn't go to the inauguration at all and didn't send any representative either. That it was something about the nuclear code briefcase exchange that didn't happen, and he wanted to keep them or something like that. even though just so you know, those codes expire exactly at noon on January the 20th.
Yep. So
and considering that the capital hasn't been nuked before that, you should see that
it's safe to say that particular check and balance worked again, regardless of anyone's willingness to do anything. The thing is that, and this has happened before, again, it's nothing new, we're partisans of ideas. There are certain ideas that are very dear to us, and we're heavily partisan on those ideas. But we're not partisans of political parties or politicians in particular. We like a politician because he says this or that. When he stops doing that, we're like, okay, then your usefulness has expired. But there are, sadly, quite a lot, both on the left and on the right, partisans of political parties or politicians, and those people tend to forget oftentimes, sometimes because they want to, or they're on a mission. There are political operatives on all sides, of course, but sometimes they forget because they're stupid or because they never knew this in the first place. Routinely it is the case that the politicians know each other, and they're not necessarily friends, but although sometimes they are, but they're at the very least acquainted to each other. I mean, the idea that a politician would start a physical war against another politician is kind of bonkers. I mean, yeah, sure, Abraham Lincoln did it, but he didn't start it against a politician. He started against a certain rebellious faction of the military, which is a whole different thing. But it wasn't because of the politicians. And I know this is, if you want to say something really triggering, to trigger all sides of the Civil War debate, you can just remind everyone that Lincoln only wanted to save the Union at all costs. And, so there's that. So yeah, the whole insurrection, that's why, now on January the 21st, as we're taping this, the topic is already quite flattened in the media. By February the 21st, very few people will even remember these things happen, because a news cycle will just move on to something else. I don't know, maybe a nuclear kerfuffle with Iran, or maybe reauthorizing in the Senate the Paris Accord, which Trump left, and now Biden wants to put the country back into, which is going to require the approval of the Senate. Probably the Senate will approve, but there's going to be other topics for the news media and the news cycle to move towards. So yeah, it's
it remains to be seen what's going to happen.
What I'm saying is that there's nothing to be outraged about, whether you're on the left or on the right. Politics kind of politics. And a certain protest of people who are pissed off at something that's not going to... it can influence the debate, sure, but it cannot stop. Just like the big protests by the left did not stop the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, it was the same thing. The big protests by the right could not have stopped the transition to a Biden administration. It is what it is.
Even then, the intention of that protest wasn't to so-called stop the steal or to stop the transfer by any chance. Let's remember there were some Antifa infiltrated there, out of which some of them were the ones that forced the lines and got into the Capitol.
I'm a bit skeptical of such claims, and the reason I'm skeptical of such claims is because there is that very nice little piece of footage with the police just opening up the barriers and inviting everyone in. So, and the reason you do this, and again, there is no conspiracy behind this, it's very simple, well, how do I know it? I've been to the Capitol Hill myself and gotten very deep inside the building. Routinely it is very easy to get in. Now, admittedly, when you're in the hundreds or 1,000 people, then you have to wait, and there are some procedures to get in legally, right? But if you're one or two people, it's almost, well, now with COVID, I guess they changed the protocols a little bit, but usually it's very easy to get in if you're one or two persons. But when it's more people and it's a tense situation, the bias of the Capitol Hill police is to try to flatten the tension as much as possible. There are multiple footage from inside the Senate chamber, right, where police are, where there is one protester, I guess, sitting on the desk of the where the chair of the Senate usually speaks from, and the police officer comes in and says, well, is there any problem here or whatever? You guys have to leave the chamber. And the protester says, yeah, we're gonna leave in about 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, exactly. It was that guy with the Lakota outfit.
And the police officer just shrugs and said, okay, fair enough, and just leaves. And then these guys, indeed, they do keep their word, and 30 minutes later, they just leave voluntarily. So, that's why I'm laughing at all of the hysterical coverage, either from the left or from the right, because, have you considered just asking those people who are actually there? Because, and yeah, sure, there are some regrettable instances in the incidents where, people get harmed, like at any other protest like this one. As I was saying, in 2016 at Sacramento Capitol, 6 people got stabbed. These things happen, and when it's a large gathering of people, and some of them are coming in with a very tensed mindset. This is just the law of big numbers. The more people you have in a place, the more likely it is to see 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 such incidents. It happens if you look at every single huge gathering, whether it's a football match or a protest, especially with protests. The more you exceed the threshold of 10,000 people in one place, the more likely it is to have 1 or 2 these kinds of, not always ending up with fatalities, but always ending up with something stupid. Because stupid is a constant within
human nature.
Within human nature, and when you have 10,000 people, there's definitely going to be 10 stupid there. Have a million people there, it's probably going to be at least 1,000 stupid. Usually a lot more, but at least 1,000 stupid. And 1,000 stupid can do a lot of stupid. All right, so January the 6th, whatever, small igloo. But I have to admit, I had a lot of fun watching the footage. Too bad that the trolling wasn't as professional as it used to be, so I got a little bit disappointed, and that's probably because there were too many of the QAnon loonies there. You should have brought in a lot of more versed MAGA heads, so they would put in some great trollery. I mean, for instance, where in Nancy Pelosi's office, if you get there, might as well put in a huge statue of Pepe the Frog or something. I mean, I'm just saying. Anyway, so then there was the inauguration, which was yesterday, the way we're taping, several days ago, the way you're watching. Flags everywhere, no people.
There were some people that sat obviously socially distanced. Normally, were the people who greet on the first part of that lawn. But then, yeah, a lot of flags and a lot of military.
Yeah, it was very boring. I mean, I think since 1996 or 2000, I don't remember if and where I watched the inauguration, the second inauguration of Bill Clinton, but at least since 2000, I always watch the broadcast from the inauguration, and Bush's second inauguration was equally boring with this one. All right, I mean, it was just so boring. As I was joking with a fellow political operative, where do we find the skip button? As we were watching live, right? Very boring. But Robinette's paranoia was indeed fun to watch, and especially those rumors that circulated within the cathedral media, who is totally not a conspiracy theory outlet, not. I believe it was either CNN or Associated Press who wrote that hilarious coverage of, we're removing the bullets from the National Guard just in case someone's gonna shoot at Biden.
Oh yeah, I've also seen videos of people that were just walking in where that green zone perimeter was placed, and you see this guy from National Guard in full combat suit, but he's got his M16
with no magazine,
with no mag inside. Then what exactly is the point of holding the gun? Why might not just leave it at base?
Well, I guess for our American friends, welcome to Romania. That's usually the case. I'm serious. I mean, with a lot of big protests, that's usually how the security looks like. I remember, I think it was 2018 or 2019, early in January, a protest here in this city. If I find the footage, I'm gonna put it so you can watch it. I don't think I caught it on the camera though. There were several police officers and gendarmerie, and some of them had weapons, but none of them had mags in it. So, and I remember poking fun at one of the officers. I'm like, if these people, they were like 100,000, or like 80,000 people, something like that. Like, if we go full igloo, what you gonna do with that? And they're like, oh well, these are the orders. So yeah, it's not really, that one is not uncommon either, but the reasoning is very uncommon. I mean, that's full-blown paranoia and full-blown conspiracy theory to believe at the presidential level that the National Guard is gonna shoot at you. I mean, come on, really?
Yeah, it's as if the bureaucrats from Washington forget that they're next to a military base put specifically there.
Yes.
in order to absolutely curb stomp you if you ever go too far. Right.
I mean, that's another aspect indeed. Most of our European friends may not know, but there is a military base just across, well, not really across the street, but very close to the Capitol Hill and the White House. It's technically speaking in Virginia, and it's part of the compromise at the end of the Civil War, so they will be within the range of their artillery, specifically with the constitutional purpose of shooting at the political class if they go too far, indeed. So, if the military wants to shoot at you, dear bureaucrat, they have multiple ways of doing it, and there's no way you can stop that by removing the mags from the from the security officers over there at the lawn. So come on, give me a freaking break. Now, of course, that's not gonna happen because nobody really wants to. I mean, if you want to get rid of Robinette, just sneeze at him. And yes, I'm gonna call him Robinette for the rest of his administration, or whichever how much longer it's gonna last. That one remains to be seen, judging by the 25th Amendment procedures within the Congress. Probably not that long. That's a separate story. But yeah, just like I called Obama, I called him Hussein Obama. Robinette, I mean, come on. That's even funnier. It's probably the only memeable part, because that's what I was about to say. It's the most regrettable aspect of all this situation is that Robinette is just not memeable. Obama was very memeable, Bush was very memeable, Trump, of course, was the meme, but Robinette is not memeable. I mean, yeah, sure, you can do the common man memes, but it's just, it's not memeable.
Well, no, it was that one with "Come on, man," and when he stumbled in that debate with Tron numbers.
Right. I think we called an episode based on that.
Yep.
Yeah, but generally he's not memeable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of terrible. And Kamala isn't that memeable either. Younger versions of Kamala were memeable. You could just say, okay, mandatory sentencing guidelines for you. And there were memes with Kamala Harris back when she was what was it, district attorney?
Yeah, when she was a DA. Yep.
Yeah, but nowadays she's not memeable either, and that's going to be a problem. And this is a prediction I'm going to make. The Democrats were going to have to go through the same process that the GOP has gone through in 15-16. The Democrats will have to go through a similar process by 2024 or 2025, probably earlier than that. The process being, getting in fresh blood within at the top of the party. I mean, look, what is the Democrat elite now? Nancy Pelosi 80 something?
No, she's actually she's
80.
No, she's exactly 80 years
or
old.
81, something like that. It's very old, right? Robinette is 74, okay. Kamala isn't that young either. Chuck Schumer is almost 80. I mean, most of these people are very old. Except for AOC, all of the visible figures are very, very old.
Yeah, but that's exactly the problem that the Democrats are going to face if they don't want to go the way of Labour went to the UK. In order to get fresh blood, well, if you look at the benchmark of fresh blood currently in the Democrat Party being Ilhan Omar,
quite frankly,
occasional Cortex, and there was another.
I'm fine with Ilhan Omar. She praised Trump when she had to. I mean, Ilhan Omar is a very good. She can integrate within the capital S system or capital S swamp, right? So she's very integrable. Well, I don't know. One is able to integrate her. It's a lot more difficult with AOC because as a progressive that I routinely watch, AOC she's part progressive and part insane, and that's the problem. At least Ilhan Omar knows or understands the game a little bit better. But yeah, the Democrats were gonna have to go through this process, and yeah, sure, there is this risk that you're talking about of going the way Labour went under Jeremy Corbyn, but that's still better than clinging to the current elite, because the current elite, is just physically incapable, and this is beyond ideas. Some things are not dependent on politics. To just take a look in your birth certificate and just go home and raise your nephews, right? Or your grandchildren, whatever. So yeah, 2022 is going to be glorious. I'm just saying.
It's definitely going to be interesting to observe how the Democrat Party will advance. If they do nothing, they're screwed. But if they do it too much, which is what I have the impression that's going to happen.
Yeah, and of course there are many people both inside the Democratic Party and outside of it who are pretty fearful of this kind of tectonic change, I guess, and of course they are afraid, just like there are many on the GOP side who were very afraid in 15, 16 of the Trump train, right? Because it wasn't Trump the person that was the problem, it was the whole swath of new people who would come into the party, and they did. And now, of course, the GOP has to go through the process of integrating all of these new people. And of course, for some of them, it's their first full election cycle. And of course, they're resentful and disappointed and whatever. They'll get over it. They'll get over it. That's the purpose of a republic, as the founding fathers used to say. When the passions of the publics run high, just delay the decision a bit more until they come back to their senses, to the extent that is possible. So yeah, that's all I have to say. I mean, and yes, the inauguration was boring, and yes, Robinette's speech was boring. Who should I compare him to? To Obama, right? Obama had a very good speech at his first inauguration in January 2009.
Let's compare him with his old boss.
Compared to Hussein, Obama, Robinette was boring. And all of the artistic claptrap that was there, boring. Oh my God, the J-Lo came in and I don't know, one portion of the lyrics, she moved them into Spanish, and oh no, history in the making, we're bringing Spanish language at the inauguration. Give me a break. That's another indicator of the culture war. That's the best Democrats could do. J-Lo has been.
Actually, they did one thing right in terms of who they invited. They invited Garth Brooks, which is the benchmark of Americana country music. True. But yeah, you can't compare that guy. Exactly after he finished singing the song, he just left us. Had a bro hug with George Bush, and obviously no mask.
Yes. Well, good luck. Getting that guy to wear a mask, that's going to be quite a challenge. But and of course they did that because. Again, no matter how bleak it may sound if you spend too much time on the internet, that's our privilege. We don't live online. But if you spend too much time on the internet, it may look very terrible. But zoom out a little bit. But the Biden administration is going to have to work with a lot of compromising stuff because his own party is pretty fractured. Not to mention the Republican Party being pretty fractured, a very fragile balance in the Senate. You don't get to do that much revolutionary stuff.
Yeah, and it's not just the fragile balance from the Senate, but let's remember that the Democrats lost seats in the House in the past election.
Yes.
There are definitely people that are observing it, how was it called, with great concern.
Great attention and concern.
Great attention and concern, that development.
Yes. So, it's going to be fun. I mean, the only regret that I have is this, that we cannot meme Robinette too much, because the guy is just not memeable. He's like an anti-meme. which is gonna be quite terrible. Hopefully they 25th him pretty fast, and I don't know, maybe get some more attractive. I mean, Kamala would become president, and maybe she picks up some more attractive, more memeable VP. Hopefully, unless she picks Nancy Pelosi, and then it's game over. Yeah.
Well, Hillary Clinton could always come back to the White House.
Jesus Christ, man.
Exactly what other real choices do they have? As far as I know, they haven't got many charismatic middle-aged people like Obama was.
But the capitalist system doesn't like her.
Yeah, no. And she will be really dangerous, but yeah, she's still not swallowed even by the old guard of the Democrat Party,
and definitely not the
and definitely not the squad tier.
Yeah. I mean, just like, Mitt Romney would better be fit into the Democrat Party, Tulsi Gabbard would be more fit into the Republican Party, which is interesting given that she hails from Hawaii, a deeply progressive state. Yeah.
Yeah, but Hawaii in itself is not exactly a progressive state. It's more about the culture there. The Americans integrate themselves in the Polynesian culture of being laid back. Don't stress yourself too much. That's why they tend to look progressive, but they're actually pretty carefree.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, the whole aloha culture plays a deep role into the politics of the state. All right. LA Times. Orange County man lived in Chicago airport for 3 months. An Orange County man is facing criminal charges after officials discovered he had been living in Chicago O'Hare Airport for the last 3 months. Aditya Singh, 36, that's an Indian name, right?
Yeah.
Was arrested Saturday and charged with felony criminal trespass to a restricted area of an airport and misdemeanor theft, according to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Illinois. During a court hearing on Sunday, prosecutors said Singh arrived at the airport on October the 19th flight from LA and proceeded to live within the airport security zone undetected, the Chicago Tribune reported. He told authorities he was afraid to fly because of the COVID-19 pandemic and said that other passengers at the airport had given him food. When 2 United Airlines employees approached him and asked for identification, he reportedly flashed a badge that belonged to an operations manager at the airport who had reported it missing in October. Said the Attorney General at the hearing. The employees called the police, who took Singh into custody just after 11 a.m. According to a Tribune, Haggerty said in the hearing that Singh was scared to go home due to COVID, and he told the authorities that he had found the badge. Assistant Public Defender Courtney Smallwood said in the hearing that Singh lived with the roommates in Orange and does not have a criminal background. She said it was unclear why Singh came to Chicago or if he has ties to the area. Cook County Judge Susanna Ortiz was reportedly troubled by Singh's ability to remain in the airport for so long and called the circumstances quite shocking. The judge ruled that Singh could be released if he paid $1,000, but said he was prohibited from setting foot in the airport. The Chicago Department of Aviation, which oversees O'Hare, said Tuesday that it has no higher priority than the safety and security of our airports. We can see that. While the incident remains under investigation, we've been able to determine that this gentleman did not pose a security risk to the airport or to the traveling public. I'm sure he didn't. We'll continue to work, blah, 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 blah. As of Tuesday morning, Singh was in Cook County Jail. He's scheduled to return to court on January the 27th. COVID-19 is a great excuse for these petty crimes, isn't it?
Yeah, and if I was the district attorney, what I would have done was to send this guy quickly to psychiatric care, because staying in an airport for 3 months, I have no idea how he managed to do it, considering how it's unbearable. I'm pretty sure it happened to you to have a layover of 10 hours. Mm-hmm. And okay, a layover of 10 hours in Europe, it's actually pretty nice, because if you end up in some place like have a layover in Istanbul, they get you tours of the city. If you go to Austria, it's pretty easy. You just take the train and you're smack in the center. If you go to Frankfurt, you get the U-Bahn. Well, but in Chicago,
no, there is. I've been to O'Hare and I've spent some time in that airport, and there is the CTA, Chicago Transportation Authority. Mm-hmm. There is a metro from the airport that takes you downtown, and it's not even expensive.
Yeah, but
it's like $2.
Yeah, but still, long layovers in airports generally suck when you're forced to. But this guy stood on his own terms for 3 months.
Yeah, the only time this is acceptable is when you're, seeking asylum or things of that nature. And even then, usually the governments try to figure out a solution within weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. But 3 months, just Christ Almighty. Indeed, and this is one issue that okay, this case is just a little bit funny and whatever. He'll probably pay a fine and he'll be fine. But it does speak volumes to the issue of how people have gotten insane over the panicardism for COVID-19.
Yeah, COVID is not a disease, more like of psychosis.
Yes, I mean, yeah, sure, there is this fluffy cough, which sometimes does kill people, just like the flu does, and yes, it kills people more than the flu, like twice more than the flu, if we are to believe the French studies on that. But the much bigger side effects are not due to the cough itself, but to the COVID-19 story or narrative. That's why I've been saying for the last 5 or 6 years on this channel, narratives matter. Look what narratives can do, right? It doesn't even have to be the truth doesn't have to be very dangerous. If the narrative about it is well enough constructed, or if it is presented in a way that is that catches on to the plebs, yes. And add to that some psychopathologies and some obviously unconstitutional measures and things of that nature, and then you get these kinds of things. And the problem is that in the United States, and this is a very old problem of the United States, they don't have readily available mental health facilities, and it's very difficult to get help related to mental health, even if you have the money. So it's not an issue of access because the poor and the rich. No, it doesn't matter. Even if you have the money, getting proper mental health care is very difficult. And it's not just the US, and many countries in Western Europe do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem, particularly in the case of the US, which is why there are all those jokes where you see on TV ads for Prozac or antipsychotic medicine. Well, it's mainly because at least in the guild of psychiatrists, the reigning mentality, and it's been that for quite a long time, is just to fill you with medicine so that you're sort of functional, or at least you're not in the state of offing yourself. Never targeting the issue.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why many Americans, for good reason, are much more skeptical of the science and practice of psychiatry than Europeans are. And it's not because many bien-pensants in Europe, right? They're like, oh, because Americans are stupid. No, they're not stupid. They look at how psychiatry is practiced in their country, they're like, I can't trust these people, and they're right. Whereas in Europe, you have a kind of a mix. There are quite a few psychiatrists in Europe who are run on the same mentality as the United States, but there are also a much larger share who at least try to tackle the underlying issue. Now, of course, with various degrees of success and whatnot. But the thing is that it's going to have to be a discussion that's probably going to hit this decade. Maybe not next year, maybe not 3 years from now, but 5 or 6 or 7 years from now, when all of the psychopathologies accelerated or even created during 2020 in particular, all of those will reach maturity by the middle of this decade, or by 27 or 26. And at that time, there's going to have to be a more serious discussion about mental health, and it's gonna be a difficult one, because many on the right outright dismiss the issue of mental health, which is terrible, and many on the left, they try, obviously not really successfully, but at least they try, because that's the leftist instinct, to politicize it. And mental health is not really a political issue. It can be if you really want to, but it's very difficult to make it political. And it has repercussions. Not treating it seriously, it has repercussions. This one is a very mild repercussion, of course. Nothing really happened.
We've had the last time that article with the woman that beat her children because they didn't wear masks inside the house.
Yeah. And these kinds of things are going to keep on happening and keep on happening. And for now, from the bien pensant perspective, you can say, oh, well, it's marginal cases. Yes, they're marginal now. But considering that there is already a pre-existent mental health crisis in the United States that has been running unaddressed for at least a decade, now compounded on top of that, the mental health issues created new by the COVID-19 hysteria, especially in Democrat states, which adopted much harsher measures with the voodoo excuse that they're going to cure COVID-19. Of course they didn't. When you compound all of those, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty. And it's going to be fun. You heard it here first. Montreal Gazette. Trudeau vows to keep up the fight to sway the United States on merits of Keystone XL pipeline. Canada won't stop trying to convince the US President-elect Joe Biden on the merits of the Keystone Pipeline expansion, Prime Minister insisted Tuesday. But even Trudeau's full-throated defense of the controversial cross-border project, which Biden appears poised to cancel, betrayed a note of resignation. Asked pointedly what he planned to do to rescue the $8 billion project, the Prime Minister lingered instead of what he'd done already, including his November phone call with the President-elect. He said it would be Kirsten Hillman, Canada's envoy in Washington, pressing Ottawa's case with what he described as the highest levels of the Biden team. And he acknowledged that the elephant in the room, that Biden's campaign team promised back in May that it would do precisely what transition documents suggest will happen on Wednesday. The political fraud project, originally proposed in 2008, aims to deliver more than 800,000 additional barrels a day of diluted bitumen from the Alberta oil sands to refineries along the US Gulf Coast. It has long been a linchpin in Canada's strategy for boosting fossil fuel exports by delivering Alberta's landlocked underground energy resources to Tidewater. It has also become a lightning rod in both countries for the perennial debate over climate change, economic growth, and society's long-standing dependence on fossil fuels. As a result, it never found favor among the Democrats in Barack Obama's White House, which included Biden as vice president. That administration slow-walked the approval process for the better part of 8 years, with much to the frustration of then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, until outright rejecting it in 2015. Canada's pitch to the Biden team has for months framed Keystone XL as a vastly different, more environmentally friendly project than the original. It's almost as if it didn't really help when y'all, and by y'all I mean you officials of the Canadian government, read over Trump in diplomatic circles. In it, Mr. Cuckdo. Right, because if I recall correctly, the Trump administration had approved the project in late 17, something like that, and they started working on it and advancing on it. And then the House, when the House flipped back to Democrat, they passed a resolution to try to stop it, and then the work on the project slowed down a little bit, but it kept on continuing. And meanwhile, Trudeau was whining over Mr. Trump, even though his entire geopolitical strategy was reliant on Mr. Trump continuing to approve his project.
Yeah, this discussion with the Keystone XL pipeline, what happened during the first Obama administration, after he won the 2008 election, that was pretty much a shit show. But it was even more important back then, considering that at that point oil prices were so much higher, and the bituminous oil was actually economically feasible to be sent. Stephen Harper actually didn't do that much pushing. And until he gave up in 2014, when he lost the election. He lost the election for other reasons, but Keystone XL wasn't one of them. But let's address this issue with a pipeline being not environmentally friendly. Yeah, there is a situation where indeed the pipeline passes through some through some parks, through some national parks. But you didn't cry when the pipeline in Alaska was built, which is okay, shorter than that, but it still goes through a national park.
Yeah.
And even then, here's a thing that very few people outside of Canada heard about a few years ago, related to the Keystone XL pipeline. I think that was it was either Trump got elected at that point. I don't remember exactly the year it happened, but it was one of the greatest environmental disasters in Canadian history. It was called the Lac Mégantic tragedy. What happened at that point was one ginormous train which was carrying through Quebec to the U.S. Exactly bituminous oil to the Gulf refineries. It derailed, and obviously it was a huge shit show, and the cleanup is still done even to this day, years later after it happened. And this has been what Canadian media did right was that they didn't ease off the pressure on this topic. Is that because those trains are still going, because obviously they need to penny pinch as hard as they can. Otherwise, if Alberta doesn't sell oil, then Alberta's pretty much gone. And then how exactly would be a pipeline more damaging to the environment than having one of these such events happen once every often?
Yeah, even if it happens once a decade, it's still a lot worse than any pipeline. Yeah, the idea of a pipeline being supremely dangerous to the environment is just bonkers. That's one aspect. The second aspect, and one has to remember that from Trudeau's perspective, Albertans vote wrongly. Right? Alberta is oftentimes referred to as Canada's Texas. So they don't vote according to the plan. So as a result, there wasn't much willingness on the part of the Trudeau administration to push forward with this particular project, which would have granted a lot more economic prosperity to Alberta. But since Trudeau narrowly remained in power after losing even more seats, and one has to remember Trudeau is a minority cabinet, he kind of had to, whether he liked it or not. If you remember, in 2015, Trudeau wins the elections because it's the current year, right? Because we're still using, welcome to year 6, Anno Trudeau.
Or current year plus 6.
Current year plus 6, right? So he wins the elections then, and kind of forgets about Keystone because his predecessor had already dropped the efforts for it. But then when he had serious troubles remaining in power, he kind of had to promise that he was gonna try. Trump, of course, didn't say no, so yeah, sure, whatever, build, because it was fitting with his agenda, of course. Now it's a little bit of a complicated situation. Indeed, bituminous oil is no longer that profitable as it was and would have been in 2008. I mean, if the construction to the pipeline would have started in 2008, it would have been a very great crisis help because soon after the economic crisis started, so it would have been a lot of jobs that were secure while building it, and then afterwards it would have been also very profitable because at the time the general global prices for oil would support this.
Yeah, so this debacle with Keystone XL could definitely, in the next election cycle in Canada, prove to be a significant problem that will go against Trudeau, because we already know Trudeau and the things he's done. He's definitely not going to fight against Biden on this topic. Well, he's generally not a fighter at all. And now considering that Biden is pretty hostile on the fossil fuels topic, you don't exactly who to fight against. What exactly Canada going to do from an economic point of view against the US on this topic specifically?
Keep the borders closed, using COVID-19 as an excuse. Maybe write a strongly worded letter with "we're sorry" at the end of it. I mean, yeah, good luck, Mr. Trudeau, in the election. For our friends in Alberta, start lobbying on this to your friends in other provinces of Canada to get this topic placed under Trudeau, basically, right? Make him guilty of it, because he kind of is. Because he kind of is. Yeah. Though admittedly most of the stupid was done during the Harper administration, but he didn't even try to fix the stupid, even though he knew how to, because there were quite a few consultants in the first Trudeau cabinet who could have helped, but he refused because he was the current year, right? And then current year +1 and +2, and you get the point. All right, let's move to more fragmented politics on this side of the pond. The Guardian: Giuseppe Conte wins confidence vote in Italy's Senate by slim margin. Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has managed to cling to power, but he will plow ahead with an even more fragile government as the country battles to emerge from the cough pandemic and recession. Conte, who has led 2 different administrations since 2018, was supported by 156 lawmakers in the Senate on Tuesday, with 140 voting against and 16 abstaining. Now that's a slim margin. Conte also won a vote of confidence in the lower house on Monday. The victory ends the turmoil triggered by former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, who last week yanked his small Italia Viva party from the ruling coalition, which includes the Five Star Movement and the Democratic Party, over disagreements about the handling of the pandemic and post-COVID-19 economic recovery plan. In his speech to senators, Conte accused Italia Viva of having creating chaos by persistently making demands that were clearly divisive. I assure you it's very hard to govern in these conditions with people who continuously place mines in our path and try to undermine the political balance patiently reached by the coalition, Conte said. Well, he's right, but he also totally deserves it. He appealed to the so-called constructors to save off the government's collapse in the middle of the pandemic, which has cost over 83,000 lives in Italy, while pledging to shake up his cabinet, modernize the country, and swiftly enact the economic recovery plan. Yeah, right. Of course, Giuseppe Conte is gonna modernize the country. Give me a break.
With whose money?
Yeah. So that. But leading a minority administration paves the way for a precarious period, as any divisive issue could jeopardize its survival. That's the point. While minority governments are nothing new in Italy, what will be unprecedented is a minority government backed by an unwieldy coalition attempting to lead the country out of the deepest economic crisis since the Second World War in the middle of a pandemic, while also trying to create a multi-year plan to manage the 209 billion euros of recovery funding from the European Union, says Wolfgango Piccoli, the co-president of the London-based research company Teneo Holdings, in a note. Conte enjoyed popularity for his handling of the pandemic during the first wave, when the country endured the tough 2 months lockdown, but has lost credibility over the government's haphazard approach to subsequent restrictions and weak financial response to businesses affected. We've shown you footage over time with the scientific debates occurring in the streets of Italian cities, mostly against Giuseppe Conte and his cabinet. I think by now everyone has realized that Conte is very, very good at clinging to power, but very, very bad when it comes to managing things and passing reforms, said Francesco Gaglietti, the founder of Policy Sonar, a Rome-based political consultancy firm, I guess. He has passed no reforms, and you can tell from the recovery plan that other EU member states are very nervous, as over 200 billion euros will go down the drain. Well, haven't we seen this movie before? Renzi had criticized the post-pandemic spending plan as weak, arguing that the money risked being squandered. His other main grievance was over Italy not tapping the EU's bailout fund, the European Stability Mechanism, to shore up the health service. Movimento 5 Stelle has always resisted this, fearing it would leave Italy beholden to strict EU austerity rules, and Movimento 5 Stelle is of course correct. Renzi is spot on these issues, Gaglietti said, and from his perspective this was a bus driving straight into the abyss, so he wanted to get out of the cockpit. Right. TikTok 2 years till the general elections in Italy. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Maybe I'm sure many of our friends may not know this, but I think it was in 2020 in April or something like that. Very recently, no more than a year and a half ago. I think less than a year though. Finally, the Italian legislature was able to pass a very comprehensive reform pack, which includes, among other things, the shrinking of the parliament. There's going to be 400 lawmakers as of the next election instead of 630 as they are now. And small parties like Italia Viva, ruled by Matteo Renzi, they will have to shine somehow. They're gonna have to shine bigly if they want to still be around, because fewer lawmakers means a higher electoral threshold. It's gonna be a little bit more complicated, and these parties that are within the margin of error, I mean, Viva Italia, Italia Viva, sorry, I think they have like 30 seats in the current legislature. And they're probably going to have less than 30 in the next one, but how much less, If they manage to stay with 25, that's going to be a win for them, but if they manage to stay with 3, that's not going to be necessarily a win. And on top of that, I don't like to be in agreement with Matteo Renzi, but he kind of has a point. The Conte cabinet has been remarkably weak. Not that it's a surprise. I mean, who else had non-weak cabinets? Oh, Berlusconi. The eternal Berlusconi. I mean, that guy has a great talent of clinging to office. By the way, he's still a very important senator to this day.
Well, of course he is, and he also controls the Rai network.
I think he still does, yes.
He still does. Well, he never ever lost the control.
Yeah, and of course the Viasat network with Italia 1, Italia 4. I think the channel was called Cinque Stelle. And so there's quite a few. He basically owns the press, right? Think of Murdoch, but stronger.
Think of Murdoch with a political position.
Yeah, and stronger. I mean, within the universe, the Italian-speaking universe, Berlusconi is the sun, right?
Amen.
He's not the whole universe, but he's the sun. And within that solar system, nothing really happens without Berlusconi, at the very least, deciding to ignore it. Not necessarily approving it, but deciding to ignore it. For more on Berlusconi, I think I made a video like 5 or 6 years ago, somewhere in the early stages of this channel. I'm gonna find it and leave a link in the low bar for you to get a more idea. I went then through his entire history and how he kept on clinging to power no matter what. And I do expect Berlusconi's faction to retain the same number of seats even with the smaller legislature. So basically he's gonna win. Because let's not forget, Rai was at the forefront of doing investigations against the Wuhan Honk organization. The whole the general prosecutor of the country, the DA, I guess, is engaged in a conspiracy case against the Wuhan Honk organization. And when that investigation will conclude, and it will, for sure, there's time until the next elections. I suspect it's going to conclude just 2 months before the election. Very timely. I'm sure it's going to be a pure coincidence. It's going to be in the sense that the Conte cabinet colluded and yes, conspired in the legal sense. With the Wuhan Honk organization to lie to the public, and it's going to be glorious.
But at the same time, there's also I think it's in Italy as well. Italy right now is also suing Pfizer.
Do they? I haven't been keeping up with that. I'm not surprised if that's the case, because well, why not? I still do expect we're going to talk a lot about Norway right at the end of the episode, but in the context of Australia. But I expect Norway soon enough to file suit against Pfizer, because they're not in the EU, so and Pfizer did not sign an immunity agreement with the Norwegian government. And if I were Fremskrittspartiet, which is the right-wing party that's called the Progressive Party, welcome to Norway. If I were them, I would push definitely for such for such action, because why not?
Yeah, Italia Viva has the chance of capitalizing on pretty much beating Conte into the ground. Because his handling of everything that happened in Italy from the beginning of March onwards, since last year, it was absolutely disastrous.
Yes, and as time went on, more and more Italians, even many of them long-term members of the Democratic Party, they're like, nah, we got this one wrong, bro.
Yeah, not only they got that one wrong, but judging by the vibe of the general population in Italy, the consensus is that they would so much like to see Conte hung in a petrol station in a public show.
Yeah. That's probably not going to happen, but it's not going to be an easy election for Giuseppe Conte, especially if one particular smiley friend and slightly fat, from a certain political party who might have been called Lega Nord in the past, Salvini I'm talking about, if he comes back with something really populist, and let's not forget, that's how Giuseppe Conte got into power, to be in the first place in 2018. In EU circles, it was called the first full populist government, because he came in as a sort of a technocrat. He was a law professor, whatever. But the coalition was Lega with Movimento 5 Stelle, the two biggest populist parties at the time. Italian politics is so much fun. It's one of the reasons why I prefer this kind of system, because if you play your cards right as a political operative, you can always keep the government in check. It's a much better check and balance because you're never reliant on a certain Supreme Court or a regional court, or on certain mechanisms that are you're always reliant on just pitting. How did the founding fathers used to say, pitting ambition against them? But you can do it in real time rather than institutionalized. So it's a lot more fun. Yes, admittedly, it's also very corrosive to the stability and whatnot, but who cares about that? It's fun. That didn't sound very...
Assuming, first of all, that there was any sort of unity in Italy.
In Italian politics, are you
no,
joking?
in Italy, speaking at the population level, there's still a divergence from being southern Italians with northern Italians.
And by region,
then there's the third party, Sicily.
And then there's within the north, there's by region, and
within the Venetians against the Florentines
and the Lombardians. Right, as that general said, we have made Italy, now we have to make Italians.
Make Italians,
Resto facere gli italiani. Good luck with that. Just as it was going well with the second part, let's make Italians, then the COVID-19 insanity hit, and that's the great reset right there. Another 50 years on that. And as for political unity, this is like the 100th prime minister in the 102 or 103 years since the country exists as a political union. It's like the 100th prime minister. So as a standard, and again, this particular average is destroyed heavily by Silvio Berlusconi, who has shown a remarkable ability of clinging to office despite of all of the divisions in the country. Without Silvio Berlusconi, it's like 3 prime ministers per year. So, Italy has a very great ability of devouring politicians. You want to come to power? Sure. Oh, okay, 2 months, you have to go.
Well, sure. You got to look at the historical record. The Roman Republic was also exceptional at chewing the politicians.
As we say oftentimes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That's why I laugh at most revolutionaries and most of the people who are afraid of certain revolutionaries, because some revolutionaries have achievable goals, and those should be addressed very seriously, and yes, should be feared if their goals are achievable and terrible at the same time. But the generic revolutionaries, we're going to change the world, and Nah, nah. Again, 2 world wars and multiple bankruptcies. They haven't been able to move an inch in the Italian society. It still functions the same as it. So, good luck with that. I'm just saying. Okay, sticking to Europe, Euronews. EU diplomats on how the bloc is preparing for the Biden's administration. 4 years have passed since Donald J. Trump stood at the west front of the US Capitol on a cold Friday afternoon to be inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States. We will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we do so with the understanding that it is the right of all nations to put their own interests first, the President proclaimed. For US allies around the world, the message was sobering, an ominous warning of impending change. What followed, however, surpassed what most expected after the former reality TV host's raucous election campaign. President Trump's propensity to make bold and shocking declarations rapidly split into his foreign policy. Speaking on condition of anonymity, diplomatic sources told Euronews there was a tense atmosphere charged with a confrontational narrative where US officials treated the EU as its foe, as Trump once called the bloc. Trade and defense rapidly became major points of contention. The EU's trade surplus with the US had risen to 153 billion euros by 2019, according to Eurostat. Any sort of deficit that made the US look weak was anathema to Trump. A senior European diplomat told Euronews that trade was the trigger for a big disaster in reference to the sanctions and tariffs that the president and his officials were constantly threatening to impose. The meeting between Trump and then European Commissioner President Jean-Claude Juncker in July 18 served to break a temporary truce, but animosity and new threats eventually returned. The administration, however, was not monolithic, the diplomat admits. There were people who did not want to blow up the transatlantic alliance, they added. Could it be that the classic textbook diplomacy these EU diplomats had been taught was futile? Fatigued by damage control, Europeans are now looking forward to the next 4 years with a measured sense of hope. The relief over the victory of Joe Biden is tangible among diplomats and members of the European Parliament. That's how you know it was a terrible idea. Who see the Democrat as a traditional Atlanticist who will honor the decades-old alliance and will work to re-energize it. It's going to be fun. They all agree that Washington and Brussels will find plenty of common ground between their global agendas, such as climate action, arms control, and human rights promotion. He will not call us a foe, Sikorsky said. Well, yeah, he's not gonna call you, but he's gonna treat you this way. But expectations are being kept low. Better to be cautious and pleasantly surprised than having high expectations and then be disappointed, explained the senior diplomat based in Brussels. That's surprisingly conservative from a diplomat in Brussels, who predicted that Joe Biden will focus first and foremost on domestic issues and then turn his attention to the world stage. Well, he'd better do that. The United States is fractured, the official said. 2020 is not 2016. The US is different and the EU is different. Diplomats and MEPs believe Joe Biden will engage with the European Union that is stronger, more assertive, and more united as a result of the cough pandemic, Brexit, and the absence of US leadership during the Trump era. Now that's copium right there. Yeah, we're more united. We're just lacking one huge member state. Christ almighty, these people are insane. But certain thorny issues like the EU's trade surplus and big tech regulation are expected to continue causing disparities between the two allies. On NATO and Europe's defense spending, Sikorsky predicts a change in tone but not in content. Trump was right, both in substance and in style, because when Obama and Bush said the same things before politely, it didn't work, he said. European officials are confident that, however complex or contentious the topic, the Biden team will restore the traditional ways of diplomacy to enable dialogue and negotiation, working alongside US allies and within multilateral organizations. But the diplomats admit there is a caveat for Europe. The EU needs to be perceived as a credible, authoritative interlocutor in order to succeed in this new chapter. Wait a minute, Trump was right? But I thought Orange Man bad!
Yeah, Orange Man was bad in the perspective of the EU bureaucrats, and the reason is that he addressed the main issue of the EU, which is it's actually a Franco-German monolith. They're the main beneficiaries of that trade deficit that works in the favor of the EU and in disfavor of the US. Trump actually literally did nothing wrong threatening with sanctions, because let's remember, it's not the 1950s anymore. Back then, this doctrine was put in place in order for the rest of Europe to not become communist, because let's remember, they wanted to be. And yeah, nothing's meant to stay forever, and the Germans bit more than they can chew.
Yeah, but let's not forget Europe still wants to become communist, so there's that. So there is a case to be made that there is still a place for such doctrine. By the same token, though, just like President Bush and President Obama and President Trump said, hold on a second, you guys can afford to party on various sorts of socialistic schemes while paying basically nothing for your military defense. That's kind of unfair.
If that will be the only problem,
but it's not the only problem.
When you look at how goody friends Germany is with Russia, that's much more concerning rather than not putting money in the military.
Yeah, I was reading recently, I believe it was on The Economist, I don't remember where, that even very normie places are discussing that, actually, you know what, cancelling the Nord Stream 2 is quite a good idea. Remember when they all demonized Trump for it? I was there at the Intermarium Summit in 18 and 19 in Bucharest and Ljubljana, and Mike Pompeo would come in and said, no, Nord Stream 2 must never happen, no, you're all insane, I'm right, you're all wrong. And then Miguel Berger, Secretary of State in Germany, was coming in and said, oh, American man bad, Orange man bad. There you go.
CIA man bad.
CIA man bad, right? And then 2 days ago, there you go, there is a vote in the European Parliament, and like a 2/3 majority be like, yeah, Nord Stream man bad. Nah, good luck with that. I mean, I wouldn't want to be Merkel at this point.
Well, she's not going to remain in power for a long time.
Until September, October, whatever. This year she's gone. But I wouldn't want to be Merkel now, because one thing that I'm sure she wanted to leave completed, essentially, as a project, would have been, Nord Stream 2. And she tried and she tried and she tried. The German diplomacy worked really hard to convince everyone the Nord Stream 2 man good. Just basically one guy, and that guy wasn't Trump, was Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo kept on insisting on every summit, and nope, Russian man bad, Nord Stream man bad, you're all insane. And yeah, sure, the bureaucrats in the EU apparatus did not like it. But you know what? Here, there you go. Mike Pompeo is not there anymore. Trump is not there anymore. And now your own European Parliament says, yeah, you know what? Mike Pompeo has a point. Get lost. So now I wouldn't want to be Ursula von der Leyen and Angela Merkel, because it's kind of difficult to see a way out for the for Nord Stream 2. And again, very normie places. Now they're basically sounding as we were sounding 3 years ago when we were saying Nord Stream 2 bad, this is terrible, it must not be allowed. And in 2017 that was far right speech. Now it's a very sensible centrist policy, and close enough to becoming de facto policy, and it will. I'm pretty confident. These kinds of debates last for several years because bureaucratic inertia, yada. You're all smart people, you know it. But the whole expectations by the bureaucrats in the EU apparatus and the diplomats and whatever. It is surprisingly conservative for them to say, well, maybe have some flattened expectations and be pleasantly surprised rather than come in with full enthusiasm. I guess they learned from the Obama administration that they approached the Obama administration with full enthusiasm and ended up being a total disappointment. May I quote you from the Obama official Victoria Nuland, discussing about the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, quote, "Fuck the EU," unquote. So that was the opinion of the Obama administration about the European Union. Then comes in Trump and say, "You guys are my foes, and now we gotta balance things out." I get it why they're now like, we'll see about that. Also, yes, Biden may be an Atlanticist, but in the sense of over the Atlantic towards Beijing rather than Brussels. Yeah, sure, they both start with B, but they're kind of not the same thing. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. And it's not going to be an easy ride for the EU bureaucracy. Yeah, probably Biden won't scream so much about the trade deficit, because Democrats don't really understand economics, so he's probably going to be easily convinced by the globalists around him to just keep
just not pay attention.
Just not pay attention to it, right. So yeah, probably in that aspect it's a win for the EU bureaucracy. But on all of the other fronts, I'm not sure. And also on big tech, this article barely mentions big tech. Have you noticed that now the term big tech has gotten mainstream? 3 years ago it was far right to even mention the idea of big tech. When Andrew Breitbart mentioned it the first, because he was the first to say big tech,
I remember that.
that was nobody spoke like that, right? And by 2017 or 18, only fringe far righters would talk about big tech. By 2019, even some lone Democrat congressmen were like the cartel in the big technology, something like that. Now big tech is just mainstream term. Euronews, right? The EU official news source, right? It's kind of like the Pravda in the Soviet Union. That's Euronews for you now. They're like, yeah, big tech, and you have to address big tech, and that's how you shift the Overton window. Many of the things that were far right 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years early in the previous decade, now they're like mainstream talk. Same thing with Islamism and many other aspects. So yeah, big tech is going to be a thorny issue, not just because, as it turns out, it may have been a terrible move by big tech to attempt to censor Donald Trump, because very few people expected to see Macron and Merkel coming in and say, hold on a second, no, that's kind of terrible. That's kind of terrible. I mean, I expected Alexei Navalny to do this. Alexei Navalny was the first mainstream politician, right, to come out and say, nah, this is kind of terrible. But then, Merkel and Macron and several other politicians, of course, the Polish administration. But again, I expected the Polish administration. Those who've been through a dictatorship, they sense these things really fast. Now, admittedly, Merkel has grown up in the DDR, so I guess we can give her an excuse as well. But Macron, I was quite surprised to see Macron coming out and say, you know what, maybe censoring a sitting US president, that's a bit too far. Maybe we should discuss regulating big tech. Maybe we should discuss, I am a big fan of stomping big tech, right? Not necessarily regulation. How about breaking them up? How about, just because, there doesn't have to be a justification for it. We're done. We're past the point where we can discuss economic justifications. No. Let's do it out of spite. Just how they censored Donald Trump. Out of spite. How about we do it out of spite as well? Why not?
Because
let's see what happens.
If big tech has gotten so big to have the nerve to have the nerve and the courage to pretty much silence. At that point, still the president of the United States. The president of the United States. Let's see if that would have happened in Russia, for example. For example, let's say that Yandex had a social media website and they censored Putin. Well, in the next 12 hours, everybody from the Yandex leadership would have ended up in some gulag in Siberia. Well,
technically speaking, Yandex does not own VKontakte.
VKontakte, that's the
VKontakte, but VKontakte and Yandex are both owned by the FSB, the Federalnej Služby Bezopasnost, the KGB. So yeah, technically speaking, they have the same boss.
But
even if they would not have been sent to a gulag, everyone would have been asking, is there a coup going on in Russia or whatever? Because censoring Putin on VKontakte, that would have raised a lot of red flags.
Doing exactly this exercise in creativity. So let's say that VKontakte was a fully private company and they didn't have FSB involvement. If they would have ended up silencing Putin
on the platform.
Doesn't matter what exactly reason. Just do it out of spite, for one reason or another. Well,
let's say during a presidential campaign where Navalny is running against Putin, and VKontakte decides to privilege Navalny's projects and posts and whatever campaign, and towards the end of the campaign just yanks the official account of the Kremlin and Putin's personal account. Why not?
Yeah.
Would anyone object seriously when Putin would say, you know what, haha, go to Gulag? Would anyone seriously object? No, of course not.
Yeah, exactly. The big tech has gotten that courageous, and if it happened to the president of the United States, then what's exactly stopping them from doing that to much more less relevant people?
Right. That was Alexei Navalny's point right before he went back to Russia to do that very nice photo op with him being arrested at the Domodedovo airport. A few days before he had traveled back to Russia, after Trump's suspension on Twitter, he released a long statement on Twitter saying that, you know what, this can be used by autocrats in other places. And of course he was giving a lot of examples from Russia because that's the place he knows best. And was saying, and then the autocrats will say, well, this is common practice. Look, it happened even to Donald Trump. So, off you go. And considering how many unsavory financial involvements are, particularly at Twitter, I think it was the government of Saudi Arabia at some point held shares there, and there are many other less than democratic places that own shares and have an influence at Twitter. Who is to say that you won't see some disappearance like these? Not physical disappearances, but they're just sent to the digital gulag. Now what? And that's why stomping on the big tech is going to be the thorny issue for this decade. I mean, it's going to be one of the debates, the meta debates of the decade. Probably it's not going to be any serious policy being passed, maybe towards the end of the decade, unless, not if, but when another huge populist force rises. But it's going to be a meta debate, and it's going to be, and it's going to have to be bipartisan, precisely because the smarter ones on the left are finally asking themselves correctly, well, what if it happens to us? Big tech has changed allegiances multiple times over the last 20 years, and they will change it again, of course. What if it starts happening to us? It's all fun and games until it comes to you, right? That's why I'm a big defender of all of the loonies on the internet, even though I don't talk to them. I'm like, no, let them speak. Let them speak, because it's better to see them where they speak and then to send them in the underground. And big tech is going to be an issue. Not to mention that the EU bureaucrats have a lot of smaller reasons, but still important to them to whine about big tech, right? They have the taxation reasons. The big tech doesn't really pay taxes in Europe, which I'm fine with it, but they're not.
Yeah, and the legislative backdooring. As to how no social media company, most of them from the US, is liable to GDPR, and that's a pretty big sticking point for them. Even though GDPR is retarded, it's still
it's a good bludgeoning tool against if it is used against the big tech. That's okay. But the diplomats are bracing for a better period under Biden. I wouldn't. And they know better. This one speaking under the so-called condition of anonymity. You can see, well, his name is Sikorski, so he's probably Polish or whatever. He's probably thinking, maybe, but let's see what happens. Because, and of course, there are a lot of radicals within the Biden administration. Biden has filled in the posts with a lot of unsavory characters, and by unsavory, I don't mean by my standards, even by his own political party's standards, and that's gonna create a lot of friction. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. BBC, protect us from unlawful killing charges, says the medics. Doctors and nurses need protection from prosecution over COVID-19 treatment decisions made under the pressure of the pandemic, medical bodies have said. Groups including the British Medical Association have written to ministers saying medical workers fear they could be at risk of unlawful killing charges. Well, maybe you should stop killing people, I'm just saying. It comes as the UK's chief medical officers said the NHS could be overwhelmed within weeks. I don't think so. The government said staff should not have to fear legal action. Well, actually, they should. The letter from the health organization points out that the Prime Minister warned in November that the NHS being overwhelmed would be a medical and moral disaster where doctors and nurses, blah, 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 whatever. It said with the chief medical officers now determining that there is a material risk of the NHS being overwhelmed, our members are worried, blah, 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 blah. Coordinated by the Medical Protection Society, the letter was signed by the British Medical Association, the Doctors Association UK, the Hospital Consultants and Specialists Association, the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, the British Association of Physicians of Indian Origin. The fuck is that? And the Medical Defence Shield. It calls for emergency legislation to protect doctors and nurses from inappropriate legal action when dealing with circumstances outside of their control. Existing guidance for doctors and nurses on when to administer or withdraw treatment does not give legal protection. It also said the guidance does not consider the circumstances of the pandemic where demand for healthcare may outstrip supply. The first concern of a doctor is their patients and providing the highest standard of care at all times. We do not believe it is right that healthcare professionals should suffer the moral injury and long-term psychological damage that could result from having to make decisions on how limited resources are allocated, while at the same time being left vulnerable to the risk of prosecution for unlawful killing. The medical organization said no healthcare professional should be above the law and that the emergency legislation should only apply to decisions made in good faith and in circumstances beyond their control and in compliance with relevant guidance. They said the change in the law should be temporary and should apply retrospectively from the start of the pandemic. How many killings do you guys want to cover up? Medical staff in the NHS are protected financially from clinical negligence claims by indemnity schemes where the state pays the costs of claims. But if someone dies as a result of a lack of treatment, doctors and nurses fear prosecutors could bring charges such as gross negligence manslaughter, which carry a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. How do you say szpagari eroi in English?
Well, when I read this one, I was actually thinking for a few minutes what could be a proper term. The closest I've gotten to is the bribed heroes.
The bribed heroes. It just doesn't sound. It doesn't have that.
It doesn't have. Yeah, I know it doesn't. Well,
yeah, you know.
Well, considering that bribing isn't it exists, but it isn't as much of a.
It's done by companies rather than regular people. Yeah, well, technically speaking, that's always also the case here. But up until relatively recently, let's say 10 years ago, it was still very common to give a personal bribe to a doctor, and as a result, the term szpagar has a different meaning when translated into Romanian rather than used in English. But the thing is that this whole thing of the hero doctors, hero nurses, whatever, that kind of propaganda was for a very short period of time broadcasted here as well in late March, early April, and then it was suddenly stopped because there were a few insane people from a certain sofa who were like, yeah, szpagari eroi. The heroes could just take bribes, and suddenly they were like, yeah, maybe that's not a good idea. Such proposals were a thing here as well. Certain unions of doctors have tried to claim a very similar thing here. Here it got flattened really, really fast, like the like that meme is everyone disliked that. that was kind of the treatment that the bribed heroes got here. Maybe they'll be treated a little bit more seriously in Britain. They shouldn't, but it's Britain. They asked everyone to clap for the NHS, so why wouldn't they excuse lots and lots of unlawful killings?
Yeah, and but the argument that all these heroes taking bribes invoked, well, it's because of the pandemic, it's because of limited resources, because of overwhelming the holy cathedral of the NHS. Well, yeah, these are pretty bullshit reasons.
Yes.
Well,
especially
UK has been to either a greater or lesser extent in pretty much a constant lockdown since the end of March. Okay, it was that big one, which I've experienced firsthand, starting the end of March up until beginning of July or end of June, don't remember exactly. Then there was lockdown number 2 that happened in November, and now you're in lockdown number 3, which is going to last until, as far as I know, 14th of February for some reason or another. So do explain this to me, heroes taking bribes. How exactly a country kept in constant lockdown get that many COVID cases?
Yeah, but well, maybe the tests are the problem, as a former Pfizer executive used to say, until he got censored from Twitter, but he's still allowed on Faceberg, so there's that. On a more serious note, there's something that needs to be said, and no matter how many people complain, the data bears it out, and there's no way to look at the numbers to reach to a different conclusion. All of this COVID-19 thing is obviously serious, but obviously less serious than any of the bullshit mathematical models. Just like I predicted. I remember I uploaded a video on March the 17th or 18th, and I said 100% of the epidemiological models given to you are all false. And at the time I was like, oh, all sorts of whining. Oh, are you a doctor? How would you know? Well, I'm not a doctor, but you know, I kind of like mathematics. And you know, the numbers just weren't adding up. And that was on March the 17th, when most people had no idea what they're dealing with. Now it's obviously the case that it's nowhere near as serious as it was initially claimed, or subsequently claimed, for that matter. And the whole idea of oh, it's going to be overwhelmed, it never happened. Yeah, sure, it happened in 1 or 2 county hospitals in Lombardy, but that's pretty much it. It never happened in Belarus, where there were no pandemic measures, none whatsoever, huge protests, all of the stadiums full, nothing happened. Yeah, sure, a lot of people coughed and a lot of people died, sure, but there was never that kind of overwhelming thing that happened in Italy, and even in Italy it was very short-lasted. Right? It never happened in Sweden, it never happened in Britain, it never happened in France, it never happened anywhere in Eastern Europe. It just never happened. Regardless of what measures the state has taken, varying from none in the case of Belarus to full-on insanity like the case of France or Romania or the United Kingdom, for that matter, it didn't matter. It just didn't happen. How many times does it have to not happen until you get through your thick skulls that it's all nonsense? And another politically incorrect truth is that, for the most part, the hospitals designated to care COVID only, they're routinely empty. Yeah, sure, the ICU ward is somewhat crowded, sure, but for the most part it's empty. And admitting that in public gets you immediately branded as a conspiracist, even though all you have to do is just take the public records, because in most of the countries of Europe, at least the state-owned hospitals, in the case of the UK, 100% of them, they're obliged by law to publish reports. How many people got in, how many people got out per day. And as months went on, you know, some obligations for them to report have kicked in, and they have reported, they have abided by the law. And you look at their own reports and you know, compare them with the previous month, the same month of 2019 or 18, and say, well, it's empty, largely empty.
Well, of course, the NHS will be overwhelmed because you lock down hospitals in order to care for COVID patients. And what about the rest of the people that don't have COVID? Yeah, you forgot that there's a myriad of other diseases much more serious than COVID in the great majority of them.
Like tuberculosis.
Oh yeah, like tuberculosis.
By the way, usually in the United Kingdom there are like 100 deaths per year from tuberculosis. 2020 will have at least 5,000. It could be because of this nonsense. Could be. It could be a coincidence.
Yeah,
sure,
and you can't say that you saved those guys from not coughing.
Those people literally coughed to death, right? I mean, you know, tuberculosis is a very serious thing, and then you have the the issue of not just the panic, but the issue of the initial protocols, which were wrong. The rush to intubate, all of that, which again, when we were saying it, admittedly on the Romanian language podcast, not here, but we were saying, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Maybe, we're not doctors, but that doesn't sound like a nice way of treating, at the end of the day, a respiratory disease. And, are we sure this is a good idea? And probably it isn't. And by April, there were reports from the Italian hospitals with many ICU nurses and doctors saying, well, actually, we have discovered from the practice that we're basically killing people if we keep on intubating them and whatnot.
Yeah, you're trying to protect them from not coughing, but what you do is you make their lungs explode. Well, if you do that and you're fully aware after so long, and you
maybe you should be prosecuted for unlawful.
You should be prosecuted into oblivion.
And probably that's what they're afraid of, because Britain has had this, rush to get more respirators and whatnot. And as the bureaucratic standard says on any bureaucracy, whether it's healthcare or the Department of Labor, it doesn't matter. Any bureaucracy has this. If you bought an equipment, might as well bloody use it because you bought it. So therefore, they bought a lot of respirators. Okay, now let's use them because we have them all. Well, it turned out that I was wrong. And okay, you didn't know this in March. Maybe you didn't know this in April. Maybe you didn't know in May. Maybe you didn't know in June. But in January next year, no, there is no excuse. And this idea of let's pass an emergency law that applies retroactively by what law standard? Because last time I checked, both in common law and in civil law, the purpose of legislation is to say how things work from the moment of the legislation onward, not backward. I don't know how the exact dicton is called in English. In Romanian is legea dispune numai pentru viitor. The law only dictates the future, not the past. That's the point. So yeah, good luck with passing emergency legislation to be applied retroactively. Now, admittedly, there is that principle when two pieces of legislation contradict each other, the judge should rule under the statute or legislation that is more favorable to the, I was about to say to the inmate, but to
the accused.
To the accused, right? So there's that. The principle is called in dubio reo. When in doubt, rule on the lenient side. But still, this kind of lunacy should not be accepted. No, you take responsibility for it. Because you know what? Being a doctor is not mandatory. Right? It's not like they were drafted and put in by force to... No. You liked all the perks, you liked all the privileges, you liked to be having your balls licked in public and plebs clapping for you. Well, there are some trade-offs there, right? What's so wrong with taking in all of the trade-offs?
Yeah, and it also creates a dangerous precedent. If this would have been attempted, because there are so many other cases from the past which also had dubious cases of how we got treated by the NHS. Forget right now the name of that kid that died in a British hospital because Alfie Evans. Yeah, exactly. Plus there was also that kid that sued the NHS for turning him transgender without providing before that
any contradictory guidance.
Any contradictory guidance.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot of those lawsuits. This decade is going to be full of them in all countries that engaged in this nonsense of transgenderist children. It's going to be terrible. I pity those kids. It's Christ Almighty, that's terrible. And it's one of the reasons why I generally hold the medical practitioners in despise, in disdain, and generally distrust them on anything, really. I mean, if a doctor said something, I will assume it's a lie until very, very heavily proven otherwise. And even then, I'll still have a doubt because the initial claim came from a doctor, and doctors routinely lie. Now, admittedly, some of them don't lie. Some of them are just being inexact. The difference being in intent, of course. So it's also that aspect from the legislation, mens rea, it's called in Latin, and it's also used the same in English jurisprudence. In bad intent. Some doctors are being inexact. They're not necessarily ill-intended. Nevertheless, it's still inexact. It's still a lie, and still produces negative effects. And that should be at the very least investigated, not necessarily to end up with, like they say here, to scare the children. Oh, but it could carry life imprisonment. It doesn't have to carry life imprisonment. It's enough to carry a huge fine and a ban from the medical practice.
A huge fine or having your doctor license revoked.
Yes, that's good enough. It doesn't necessarily have to be imprisonment, or if it is imprisonment, it doesn't have to be life imprisonment. But some of these egregious cases where due to either incompetence or malevolence, you've had people that were forcibly admitted to hospitals due to allegedly having COVID-19 and in reality having nothing, or people who should have survived COVID-19 and they didn't because of the terrible treatment decisions. Those cases should at the very least be investigated. And this whole idea of, but let us protect no. Just like in the military, all of the decisions get to be investigated by a committee, and even if the result is okay, some of these soldiers or the generals or the lieutenants or may end up being sanctioned anyway, because even if the result is satisfactory to the mission, if the decision is not made in accordance with the international law and the military law, you still get sanctioned. It would be the same thing. And I'm using this analogy because many countries have resorted to military protocols in the early stages of the pandemic to deal with with the Wuhan flu, right? No, because no. Now, speaking of dangerous precedents, Daily Wire, Germany to hold quarantine breakers in refugee camps and detention centers. Germans who repeatedly violate COVID-19 quarantine rules will be held in detention centers and possibly under police guard, according to new reports. Officials in the state of Saxony, which includes Leipzig and Dresden, and is currently seeing a spike in COVID-19 cases, have approved plans to hold quarantine breakers in a fenced area in a refugee camp, the Telegraph reported. Another state, Brandenburg, also plans to use a refugee camp to hold quarantine breakers. Meanwhile, in Schleswig-Holstein, repeat offenders will be held in a juvenile detention center, the report said, citing Germany's Die Welt newspaper. The state of Baden-Württemberg, meanwhile, would hold the violators in 2 hospitals, which will be guarded by the police. That's the state where I have to travel very soon. Citing Dr. Christoph Degenhardt, an expert in administrative law, Die Welt reported that German states have been granted powers to do so under the Disease Protection Act, an emergency law passed in March. Actually, we didn't pass in March. Infektionsschutzgesetz passed in December and came into force in January.
Yeah.
American press. The plan has been widely criticized, with one lawmaker, Joanna Kotar, accusing the Saxony government of reading too much Orwell. German authorities have come under fire for their management of the pandemic, with proposals to impose national vaccine mandates in a bid to control the virus, branded social dynamite by opposition figures. It comes as Chancellor Angela Merkel considers imposing a mega lockdown and suspending public transport after sparking a public backlash in the UK by calling the mutant COVID the British virus. Okay.
I just got one thing to say about this. Put them in camps. Oy vey.
In Germany.
In Germany. It's as if Germany doesn't have a historical record involving camps and holding people against their will.
Yeah. So first of all, there is a factual mistake there. The Infection Protection Act, whatever how they call it, Infektionsschutzgesetz.
The Disease Control Act.
Yeah, right. The particular legislation was passed in December. We've shown you footage from the rigorous political and scientific debates that occurred in Berlin and other German cities while the law was being debated. It was due to come into force either on January the 1st or January the 14th. I don't remember exactly the day, but it was in January for sure. And it's not really like that. I mean, the headline is wildly exaggerated, but this kind of reporting is great propaganda. I mean, if the opposition doesn't use it to further vilify the Merkel administration, then you deserve everything that's happening to you. I mean, if we could tie this with the new head of the CDU, is a guy who has a lot of, I forget his name because he's just newly elected, but I'll have to get myself up to speed with German politics for sure within the next month. But if we could tie this with the new head of CDU, who has a lot of Chinese contacts and whatnot, so we can then successfully paint him in public as wanting to put people in concentration camps. And it would also help a lot if we could find a Jewish person to break repeatedly COVID-19 regulations multiple times, so we can then, get that Jewish person to be sent into whatever, because, these kinds of juvenile detention. I've seen how the juvenile detention centers look like in Germany. They're basically hotels. So, as I said, it sounds a lot worse when it's reported in English. It's nowhere near that bad. But, just get that Jewish person to be put in there, and, someone to videotape as they're being taken there. And then, blow it up in an anti-Semitism scandal and get all of the parallels correctly. And yes, of course, this should be exploited politically. I mean, there's elections 8 months from now. Exactly 8 months from now. It's January the 21st. I think the September the 21st is the election day in Germany. And yes, I want to help. And this is something that should be done. I'm saying. There is a Judenfraktion within AfD. Get a younger one to do this. It doesn't necessarily have to catch COVID-19, just have the certificate that he has COVID-19. You all know that's easy, especially in the eastern states. And of course, that's where you find more AfD members. And, with the exception of Baden-Württemberg, all of the others are from the, how they call it, the Neue Bundesländer, basically the former DDR. And I'm not surprised that these are coming mostly from the former DDR, usually the countries that have, and the places that have experience with dictatorship. Some of those dictatorial reflexes came back with a vengeance during the pandemic. Usually they came back in public, but then soon enough got flattened, like it happened in, all over Eastern Europe. So probably it's the same thing is going to be the case here. But still, I mean, it would be fun. This should be exploited politically, because again, this won't last long. So it's a very short window where you can do this.
Well, I'm going to offer this opportunity to our audience to engage in playing this practical joke. I'm going to get my passport sorted in February, and if you donate, then I will actually go get the COVID certificate and play this prank on the German political class.
Now it has to be a German citizen, unfortunately, because with
equal treatment under the law. What happened?
Yeah, but it's a little bit more difficult. I'll have to read up and maybe ask one of our German lawyers and German students of law. See if it is possible with EU national, non-German. We'll see if that's possible. Yeah, sure. But I'm not sure. It would be much better if it is a Jew with a German passport, because that's a lot more fun. Because that person can then swiftly either sign up to AfD or FDP or whatever, and they just start campaigning and be one of those figures, kind of like the based stick man in the United States, right? Such a personality should be created, right? Because then it would not only flatten this particular decision, but it would flatten the whole arsenal of the left, who will just anyone who disagrees with CDU, his mother is Putin and his father is Hitler, because that's what they're going to do. They say no, our main figure of the opposition is a Jewish man who was sent to concentration camps due to COVID-19 by this government. I mean, that in itself is now that's a propaganda dynamite. It's just like it's not a dynamite. It's like throwing the Moab on them. Because that's very difficult to spin out of. Now, of course, it is possible. I'm not going to provide free consultation.
Particularly in Germany, where they're pretty avoidant of being called anti-Semitic.
And just every single day, just call them anti-Semites, because they're rushing Jews into concentration camps and all over again. Oy vey, that's terrible. Oh my goodness.
We could get Israel riled up on this as well.
I don't know if we can convince Bibi Netanyahu on this stunt, but I think I know who to call.
Well, it doesn't have to be him. It just has to be a guy who would reach Bibi.
Yeah, but it's doable, and even if it doesn't create a huge scandal, it does create a starting point from which you can rally people who would otherwise either not attend the polls, now not turn out to the polls, or who would turn out the polls but wouldn't get involved in activism. So you can rile up another crowd that is separate from the crowds already existent in the wider opposition to CNOOC, which I would include, of course, AfD and FDP, and the lateral movement, who's been doing those very glorious protests. Congratulations to those people. I love your protests. Hope you can keep them up until I get there, because I want to attend one of those protests. They're fucking glorious. So there are quite a few crowds that are already lining up for the opposition and getting ready for the elections, but this will create a new crowd, and it's an argument easy to sell even to the posh intellectuals and bien-pensants. They cannot say no to this because it's such a great bait. Yeah, sure, they may not enthusiastically throw it and say, no, this is my bait, but they're going to have to take the bait, because if they don't, you can shame them in public for ignoring institutionalized anti-Semitism in the country, and there's no way you can get out from such a controversy in Deutschland. So yeah, this should be exploited politically. Yeah, I know it's cynical and I know it's terrible for me to say this, but yeah, I mean, again, we did it here. It was done by a friend of ours in Slovakia. Slovakia ended up being thoroughly criticized by OSCE for its treatment of gypsies during the national lockdown and whatever. In reality, there were just two marginal cases, but augmented well enough, and Slovakia is a small country. It's not complicated to augment a marginal incident to make it mainstream. And eventually the government found itself hit from all sides, right? So all of that had to be flattened immediately, and it was. Here, the same thing. We riled up the right, and we riled up some of the centrists, and then we riled up the far left with several incidents by the police and the gendarmerie against certain gypsies. I have no idea who those gypsies are. I don't care. What I did care was the photo op, because that's what's important. And of course, on top of that, you can use the pre-existent institutional bias that exists. Now, if I want to piss off my right-wing friends, I'm going to say it. Yes, the police in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Romania, they do have an anti-gypsy bias. It's nowhere near as terrible as the far left makes it to be, but it exists. So it's very easy to get your photo op done. You just have to work a little bit. Now, admittedly, it's a lot harder in Germany because there is no anti-Jewish bias within the police. There isn't. Anyone who tells you there is, they're just lying or have no idea what they're talking about. But, if the law says that, repeated COVID-19 breakers of the quarantine regulations, whatnot, get to be sent there, you don't have to tell them that the person you're baiting them with is Jewish. They have to learn it after. Yep. All right. I'm just saying, it's doable, and it could be fun. All right, let's take a break, and after that we'll come back with Africa and Asia. Let's listen to something from our German friends. Let's listen to Scheiß Squad, written as in English but meant as in German. Scheiß Squad, I Can Keep You Safe. All right, we're back. We've been kept safe by Shy Squad, and you've been watching, I believe, footage from Timișoara, since we've been spending quite a lot of time in the western city of the revolution. Today more like the traffic lights Schara, right?
or Fritzischer.
Or Fritzischer, yeah, with their German mayor.
Yeah. And he's legit German compared to our president.
Yeah, no, legit German, born and raised in Germany, for 10 years member of Die Grüne, and now mayor of Timișoara, obviously we call it Fritzischer now because his name is Dominic Fritz. I wanted to interview him as well while being in Timișoara, and just in the day when I was collecting the phone numbers where I should call and schedule an interview, he got discovered with COVID-19 and was supposed to stay at home, and sadly missed the opportunity. Not a problem, his term lasts till 24. It's gonna be
plenty of time until then.
Yeah, and you know, he's very approachable. Basically, anyone who wants to hold an interview with him just has to have a little bit of patience, and he will answer. Alrighty, Africa. CNN. Uganda sends a lesson to other authoritarians that controlling the internet works. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni claimed Saturday that he had been re-elected for a sixth term despite widespread allegations of fraud and intimidation. In power since 1986, Museveni has been defied repeated attempts to remove him over the years, cracking down on protests and jailing potential rivals. In recent elections, a key tactic in curtailing opposition has been to control Ugandans' access to the internet, blocking social media and messaging software like WhatsApp, and even instituting countrywide internet blackouts, cutting the population off from the information at the most vital time. This year was no different. As Ugandans prepared to go to the polls last week, more and more of the internet gradually slipped out of reach, starting with Facebook and other social platforms, before finally the entire country was disconnected. The effects of such a shutdown go beyond online expression. According to NetBlocks, an internet freedom monitor, such a blackout could have already cost the Ugandan economy around $9 million, while CIPESA, an African internet NGO, reported that both biometric voting systems and mobile money, which many Ugandans rely on for payments, were both disrupted by the shutdown, so I see no damage there. In a speech last week, Museveni accused Facebook of arrogance after it closed several accounts linked to the ruling National Resistance Movement for alleged efforts to manipulate the election, saying a subsequent block of the platform along with several other websites was unfortunate but unavoidable. That social channel you are talking about, if it is going to operate in Uganda, it should be used equitably by everyone who has to use it, he said. If you want to take sides against the NRM, then you cannot operate in Uganda. We cannot tolerate this arrogance of anybody coming to decide for us who is good and who is bad. Thanks to Museveni's control over traditional media in the country, Wine has relied on online platforms to get his message out. So the ban on Faceberg and Twitter affected him far more than the president or the NRM candidates. In the past, Ugandans have been able to get around limited blocks using VPNs, software, blah blah blah, and other censorship circumvention tools, enabling them to bypass the restrictions by tunneling their traffic. There were signs this year that the censors are catching up, however, with many VPN servers being blocked and finally a full shutdown ordered, cutting off all traffic. Well, actually, it's not all. After a brutal months-long crackdown on the media, Uganda's internet disruption is the latest attempt to keep the country's citizens in the dark and to prevent journalists from reporting on events surrounding the vote, says Mutoki Mumo, a regional representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Ugandan authorities should reverse course and take steps to ensure unrestricted internet access and guarantee that the public is adequately informed during the post-election period. Such a move seems unlikely. As of Monday, Uganda remains largely cut off from the global internet, according to Monitor NetBlocks, even as Wine and other opposition leaders attempt to contest Museveni's declaration of victory. Wine himself has been under house arrest for several days. In a message on Facebook, visible to the rest of the world but not to his fellow citizens, the former reggae star wrote that, quote, "Everyone, including the media and my party officials, are restricted from accessing me." Museveni, aged 76, has outlasted many other one-time African revolutionary leaders. showing an ability to stay in power that exceeds even former stalwarts like Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe. For decades, this was relatively simple, thanks to the well-funded Ugandan military and alliance with the United States and other major world powers. But as the country has developed, becoming one of sub-Saharan Africa's strongest economies, the government's ability to respond to demands from a growing and increasingly well-educated, connected population has waned. According to the IMF, Uganda has one of the fastest-growing populations in Africa and needs to create more than 600,000 jobs a year to cater for its expanding labor force, a task that has been made all the more difficult by the cough-cough pandemic and subsequent economic contraction. Museveni has sometimes appeared less than sympathetic to his citizens, saying in 2017, following another hotly contested election during which internet restrictions were rife, "I hear some people are saying I am their servant. I am not a servant of anybody." In his speeches, he often harkens back to his history as a revolutionary, but Museveni's real talent has been for adapting to modern methods of control, not least online censorship and surveillance. Such tactics have spread across the continent in recent years, used in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, Sudan, and further afield in Kashmir, Bangladesh, Belarus, and Myanmar. There were more than 200 internet shutdowns in 2019, according to the Keep It On coalition, a trend that continued throughout 2020, with some governments using the pandemic as an excuse to introduce new online controls. Uganda has been a leader in this regard, thanks in part, critics allege, to the assistance of China, which has invested heavily in the country, increasing its influence over the formerly stalwart US ally. Chinese firms, both state-backed and nominally private, have also established a major presence in Uganda, reportedly supplying core internet technology and network monitoring equipment. During a visit to Beijing in 2017, Government Minister Evelyn Anite spoke admirably of China's model of internet control, saying she had asked for help to fight back against those in Uganda who were using social media platforms such as WhatsApp, Faceberg, and YouTube and Twitter to commit crimes with impunity. Museveni's growing grip over the internet, both technological and through new laws against cyber harassment and offensive communication, has enabled his government to limit the effect of the internet as a platform for organizing against him. As the former revolutionary begins his 6th term in office, other wannabe authoritarians facing their own online dissenters will be taking note. Now, of course, this is fake news. It has to be fake news because we know from our betters from the left, right? And we're just a basket of deplorables. And our betters from the left told us that laws against cyberbullying and offensive communications, those cannot be used for totalitarian purposes. And claiming otherwise means you're a far-right conspiracy theorist loon and your mother is Putin, right? So the blue check marks on Twitter told us so. Therefore, it must be true. So this is fake news. No, it's not. No, it's not. I've been to Uganda. No, it's not. No, it's not. Sadly, it is true news. But this is what happens when you live online. On one hand, techno-optimists should also take note, but of course they won't. They never do. Unless they get locked inside their own houses when Google services get shut down. That's when they start to take note that maybe living online is not a great idea. But other than that, and of course I'm sure nowadays the techno-optimists in Uganda have taken really, really much note. I remember speaking with a few of them back when I was there, with the idea of look, you shouldn't be relying on online payments at all. And there were certain areas where, often people wouldn't even buy a pack of cigarettes without using an online payment. I'm like, it should be reversed. Online payments should be rare, cash payments should be norm. And of course, at the time, techno-optimists there were like, oh, come on, that's never going to happen. Well, now it happened. I wrote to a few of them, but I guess since their internet is shut down, it's going to take a while until they reply back. But I'm pretty sure their attitude has suffered some amendments. Now, on the other hand, these kinds of things of internet shutdowns, the business is a little bit more complicated than it is made to appear in the media. And this one was CNN or BBC, doesn't matter. These kinds of cathedral media outlets, they're also run by boomers for the most part. And even their younger people they're just CNN. They're, how do we call them? Technologically illiterate, I guess, or functional illiterates in terms of technology. The thing is that the only way you can do an effective internet shutdown is if you're an island, so if you're Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Iceland, there are a few places where you can have an effective shutdown, but of course that's pretty expensive. In the case of Iceland, it wouldn't be expensive because there's just one cable.
The cable, pretty much.
Yeah. With the United Kingdom, it's a lot more complicated because there are hundreds of cables. So, but you can do it if you're an island, or if none of your terrestrial neighbors are very well developed in terms of telecommunications infrastructure, and particularly internet infrastructure. Now, in the case of Uganda, the neighbors aren't particularly well developed, so I guess. But in the case of Belarus, they're bringing example Belarus. Well, the internet shutdown in Belarus in September, in Lukashenko's attempt to flatten the organizing of the protests, the only effect that it had was, I was watching the protests live. And the only effect that it had is I had to wait for 5 minutes until a new stream popped up. That was the internet shutdown. So, minor disruptions in the Telegram channel, and they had to switch the link of the stream. That's it. So, but again, Belarus doesn't have this privilege. There's Ukraine, there's Poland, there's Lithuania. It's very difficult to conduct an internet shutdown when your neighbors are fully developed. So yeah. Now, on the wannabe authoritarians who... The best way, if you want to curtail these things, is not through technological solutions, because unfortunately for them, the internet has this bias of always rerouting, and it's very difficult to stop all of these, unless you can do it physically, which you can only do on islands. The best way is still through legislation. I mean, the CNN has it backwards here, where they only mention cyber harassment laws and offensive communication laws at the end of the articles. No, the article should have started with that, because that's the most efficient way of controlling online speech. Because there's such thing called self-censorship.
Yeah, but considering that Uganda, a country which is pretty important in Africa, but almost goes way below the radar on the planet in terms of what's happening there, because this debacle with this president winning his 6th term, and everything that he's done. I remember back when he won his 4th term, there was a significant scandal where he used the military to sort of suppress his opponent.
Yes, and at that time there were soldiers placed outside of the polling stations, and if you looked as if you might vote for the opposition, suddenly your papers weren't in order, and the military would just politely ask you to fuck off. You don't get a vote.
Exactly. But him resorting to what he did, it raises an even bigger question of who exactly elected or imposed big tech to decide what gets discussed on their platforms.
Yes.
Because that's where, even this article says, that's where it all started. It started with Facebook banning him the president, and also his other Facebook groups or Facebook pages of his political party, and that's when he decided, if you really want to play the censor role, then I'm gonna play the censor role on you. Yeah. And the calculation was, of course, if I ban Facebook, who's going to be more affected? Well, my opponent, because I have the fucking military. I have just a huge gun. You have Facebook. Now you don't have Facebook. Good luck. Yes. With great sadness, I must find myself in agreement with Mr. Museveni when he says, where does he say here? Hold on a second. Because I have to quote this once again, because he has a point. That's unfortunately, but he has a point where he says that it is unfortunate. There you go. The social media channel you're talking about, Facebook,
If it's going to operate in Uganda, it should be used equitably by everybody who has to use it. If you want to take sides against the NRM, well, him, that is to say, then you cannot operate here. We cannot tolerate the arrogance of anybody coming in to decide for us who is good and who is bad. You know, the guy has a point. I'm sorry. And he says, yes, the ban of Faceberg and other websites was unfortunate but unavoidable. Because, yeah, well, of course, when you say unavoidable, that's of course an exaggeration. Of course, it wasn't unavoidable, but given that he's an authoritarian leader with not absolute power, but definitely a lot of power, you know, you piss him off, haha, you go to Gulag, right? And that's the thing, the scandal did start because of Facebook. You know, Facebook was the first to provoke it. It did not start because he's an asshole. Now, he's an asshole regardless whether he bans Facebook or not, and all of it. He's an asshole anyway. But you coming in and putting more gas on the fire doesn't really help. It's almost as if, censorship itself is kind of terrible, regardless of whomever it is being imposed upon, right? I wonder if there is a sociological or economical theory that could have predicted the,
the law of unintended consequences.
The law of unintended consequences, right? Yep. You know, Facebook coming in with this belief, arrogant belief that, we can secure everyone's elections by making sure that nobody is manipulating and maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you don't know better. You know, maybe you should just fuck off.
Yeah, and the same exact arrogance that they exercised in silencing Museveni and his party is the same exact arrogance that they practiced when they banned Donald Trump 2 weeks before his official presidential term
even
ended.
less than a week. It was very recent. But yes, no, it's the kind of arrogance that the tech bubble.
It was exactly after the so-called capital insurrection.
Right. Okay. About 2 weeks before the end of his term, right? But then again, you know, it's the arrogance that is the problem. Again, the ideas are the problem because you know, great minds talk ideas, simple minds talk events, and stupid minds talk people. It's kind of, you know, the idea is the problem. Yeah, sure, you ban whatever, and probably they'll unban him, and who cares? But the idea itself that is underpinning the action. We in the big tech bubble, we know better. No, you don't. And at some point, I suspect this decade, it's gonna bite you in the ass. Because it's gonna have to. At some point, you're gonna piss off, okay, you pissed off Museveni, who cares? But at some point, you're gonna piss off someone stronger. And then what? Because, you know, if you're banned in Uganda, you know, globally speaking, probably it's a small market. I haven't checked the numbers, but it's probably a small market. It's not really that important. How about if you piss off, you know, the ruling class in South Africa? It's not difficult to piss off those people. They're very similarly totalitarian minded as Museveni. Or you piss off the CCP, or you piss off Putin, or you piss off the Ayatollah, or you piss off the European Union, which is an ongoing issue, right? You know, at some point, it's going to bite these people on their asses. And when that is going to happen, they're going to, of course, cry foul. And by that time, the reservoir of favorable public opinion will have been drained. That's what I'm saying. Because there's already an increasingly bipartisan consensus. Okay, not in Africa yet, but it's soon going to be in Africa as well. That, you know what, big tech kind of sucks. Yeah, and they kind of need some boot in the teeth.
Yeah, and in the European space, it's becoming to be a bipartisan effort because you got the Western European bureaucrats who are upset at big tech in general and particularly social media for circumventing GDPR, circumventing taxes. And then you get the conservatives from Eastern Europe who are upset that
on free speech grounds.
On free speech grounds.
And soon enough, Poland is going to have a very nice piece of legislation. And once that law comes into force, I'm gonna grab a residence permit in Poland, so I can have a Polish social security number. And then I'm gonna move. I'm gonna create again, because my original one got deleted. I'm gonna create again a Facebook profile in my name from Poland with my official name. And then I'm just gonna troll them into oblivion until they suspend me, and then I'm gonna go and file a complaint with the Polish authority. Ha ha! Fines go brrrr. Why not? Why not? And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure there are at least hundreds of thousands like me, probably millions. And once that's gonna happen, and it will, whether it's gonna be Hungary or Poland or France. France is already also trying to pass some big tech regulation that includes things like legal speech and things of that nature. Once that happens, and it will, maybe it's gonna take 2 more years, maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 3 months. Who knows? But once that's going to happen, it's going to be quite fun. And a scandal like this one would have had a much bigger impact in the public opinion 5 years ago than now. Because 5 years ago, there were very few people who despised big social media and big tech. Nowadays, yeah, sure, it's kind of terrible that you got censored in Uganda, but maybe you kind of deserved it. I'm sure Mr. Wine, the main opposition, the leader of the opposition, I'm sure he's not thrilled by this. And of course, it does provide a glimpse into the clown world where the whole planet can see his Faceberg posts, except anyone inside Uganda, and that's kind of honk. That's kind of honk, but at the same time, can we shed a tear? Not really. Yeah, and again, I have nothing against Mr. Wine. I'm sure he's a fine chap, or even if he's not, he's still better than Museveni, because at the very least he hasn't been in power for the last 37 years, or whatever, 35. So at least from that perspective, he's probably preferable. But at the same time, he would have been better served if Faceberg wanted to help the opposition. He would have been better served that instead of censoring the NRM, maybe boosting his posts, suspending the rule, because there is a rule on Faceberg that if you don't pay for sponsored posts, maybe 10 or maybe 15% of the people who like your page get to see your posts immediately in their news feed. Maybe suspend that and get it up to 100% for the election. Nobody would have noticed, and everyone would have thought that it is an organic spread of his message, and maybe he would have won the election, or at the very least get a much better standing in the parliament. Now, do I have to teach you these kinds of things? But that's the thing. Too many in big tech either have forgotten, or those who held the previous ideas left big tech. And many of the people who are now in big tech hold a very similar mentality with Museveni, and with Putin, and with, Bernie Sanders. Although Bernie Sanders is not for censorship, so it's a terrible example. Maduro, right? Maduro still has a Twitter account, by the way. And Ayatollah Khomeini. That's kosher.
It's kosher to chant "Death to America" once every few times on a tweet. Death to America and death to Israel.
Yeah, that doesn't create real world violence, right? That's absolutely okay, absolutely halal. But Trump tweeted a mean meme and wrote a mean text, and that's terrible. And these kinds of, although admittedly it's the standard with the left, as we always say, if the left hadn't had double standards, they wouldn't be having standards at all. But still, these kinds of double standards, you can use them once, twice, thrice, maybe 100 times. But at some point, a critical mass of people catches up and say, "Hold on a second, you know what? Enough is enough." And
if they don't get away from this sheer arrogance, not only that arrogance at the level of the individual is an issue with people working in tech in general, but now that arrogance atomized within companies, and those happen to have a significant influence in the social communications of a nation. So when you mix that up along with totalitarian impulses like censoring one side or the other, well, that exactly is going to be what's going to lead to your demise in the end. You're never going to admit that you did something wrong.
Yep. And you're going to see a lot more instances because there is this whole prevalence of big tech and their let's call it an undue influence created a class of sociologists, pundits, whatever, the people who talk for a living, right? Who now make the entirety of their calculations and electoral analysis based on the online presence. Now that sometimes can be very useful. The problem is that this new class of people, they take that as the accurate reflection of reality. And routinely over the last 5 years, they've been consistently surprised when things did not turn out the way they thought they would. Because increasingly a lot more opposition movements, whether on the left or on the right, they've learned that, hold on a second, we don't have to be beholden to these corporate cucks. There is still such thing called printers, there is still such thing called paper, and there is still such thing as couriers who can physically deliver the manifestos to people, and it's no longer that expensive. You can get a lot of, we delivered manifestos, we personally, and of course had other people to do it as well, and it's efficient. Now, of course, we did it only as an exercise, and we've seen how this works, and then when we're going to need it for a more serious purpose, we already know how to do it. And if we could do it with a tiny budget, because again, the SOFA is not a rich operation, then definitely a political party, even a smaller one, the kind of party that gets 5 or 7% of the polls, that's still good enough. A political party like that can afford a physical operation. Heck, the Democrats in the US, right? They relied a lot on the physical and going door to door, and eventually, at least when it comes to the presidency, turned out to be a winning strategy. Not so much with the House and the Senate, but it turned out to be a winning strategy, just gathering only the people who despised Trump but weren't necessarily Democrats. That definitely made a difference. And again, the Democrats usually were the party of the big tech and all online. And even with the pandemic, as they were urging people to do everything online, they weren't, and for good reason, of course. We spoke last episode about the so-called far-right party that got into the Romanian parliament. One of the reasons they got that huge score was precisely because the mainstream parties were somewhat observing the pandemic restrictions, somewhat, to various degrees of approximation.
So much just for show.
Well, at the end of the day, this is still Romania. I mean, there's no way you can convince people to actually stay at home for real. But at the same time, at least their leadership was trying to avoid big campaign events and things like that, somewhat observing the restrictions. Whereas this new political party were like, no, we're going to get into a huge bus and tour the country and do it on foot, door to door, and we're going to speak to the people, and yes, we're going to have big events. Who cares if we get fined? We're going to have to march forward, and that turned out to be a winning strategy. Soon enough, if this whole nonsense with big tech continues, and it might, it's very likely that it will, a lot more people and a lot others political parties will learn this, and will just have to relearn what they used to know 15 years ago, namely that elections are won on foot. And I guess this should be great news for me, because I'm accustomed to working in politics on foot and physically. I've never been able to adapt to this kind of online nonsense, because there's no way you can convince me that maybe in the very tight elections where there's only two candidates, and at the end there's a difference between the two of them, like 10,000 votes or whatever, in an election with 10 or 15 million votes. Yeah, maybe you can convince me there that the online push played a role, maybe. But in parliamentary elections, there's no way you can convince me.
The greater effort is still done on foot, regardless of the country.
Yes. It's true even with the weaker democracies like Uganda.
Exactly, but as you've mentioned, those sociologists that ended up in the bubble believing that anything that's all the opinions that are online are exactly the same opinions on in reality. Though those also expanded at the level of society. The entire business model of social media websites, particularly Facebook and Twitter, are to create bubbles.
Yeah, whether it was, in the case of Twitter, at least you get to create your own bubble and you have full control over how the bubble looks like. So, you know, if you get stuck in a bubble, it's kind of your fault. Yeah. But in the case of Faceberg, unless you know exactly how the algorithms work, so you have to have some background in IT so you can get an idea. You know, most regular people who are, yes, technologically illiterate or who just simply don't know these things, and they have a right not to know, because not everyone has to be an expert in algorithms. That would be crazy. They ended up being shocked at certain election results in various countries, because they're like, but who votes for these people? I have never heard of them. And yeah, well, you didn't hear because you're in the wrong bubble. And at some point, this will create clashes. So in a way, Museveni's action was like kind of a valve. You know, at least he came in and broke the bubble, and now, well, in a way, he united the country against him. So for now, it's the scandal can be flattened a little bit, but this won't stop. As for China's involvement, oh, come on, paint me shocked. What? China sold surveillance equipment to African dictatorships?
What exactly did China do? Did Huawei sell them a few routers or switches?
Yeah, it is a little bit more because, and this is again, I don't want to defend the CCP here. Our next article is about how the CCP sucks. So, so it's not the intention to defend the CCP, no, but it's a bit difficult to blame this one on China, the situation in Uganda, because yeah, what did Huawei sell them some switches and some routers? I mean, come on. As for the state secretary who lauded China's model of internet control, yeah, sure, but Uganda doesn't have the Great Firewall of Uganda. It doesn't have many of the technological infrastructure that China has in order to enforce their model of internet control. And let's not forget, in China, most of the internet control is still done manually. You have 1 million or 2 million government operatives whose job is to troll as in TRAWL, all sorts of threads, and just remove everything that is not government approved. We've discussed this 2 episodes ago with China's COVID-19 propaganda campaign. And so, you know, even if one were to try to adopt China's model, there are still some logistical challenges. And where would Uganda find hundreds of thousands of people, and with what money would they pay?
Yeah, and not just that, but even if you were technically capable of doing the Great Wall of Uganda, the societal consensus isn't there to want such a measure. Yeah, whereas in China, yes, which is why China is the only place that exercises censorship to that extent.
Yes, this is another politically incorrect fact. Maybe not the majority, but a significant minority of the Chinese population likes the current regime, and they like it quite a lot, and they think it's a good idea. Sure, we believe they're wrong, but they like it. There is something to latch on to say, look, there is actually a consensus here. There is not such thing in Uganda. Heck, there isn't such thing in Iran. They tried it in Iran several years ago, and the Ayatollah himself had to come out and said, well, actually, we can't do it, because, you know. literally, like, everyone disliked that. So as a result, we're like, whatever. So they just pretend in public that Twitter is haram, and that's pretty much it. But the Ayatollah posts on Twitter, even though Twitter is haram. So, and in China, of course, there is a lot of hypocrisy around it. Twitter is haram in China, but then all of the CCP operatives have Twitter accounts, and some of them verified, blue check mark.
And Chinese state media also has Twitter accounts.
Of course.
Like Xinhua Global Times.
The Global
South
Times.
China Morning Post.
Who owns South China Morning Post? Because sometimes they post a lot of dissident content, and I don't think it belongs to the CCP. I think it's Hong Kong owned or something like that.
As far as I remember, yeah.
Because oftentimes they do post things that the party doesn't want you to see. Like, for instance, the July 2019 Wuhan protests against the party itself. The populace rose up and started beating up the cops. They were protesting against an incinerator or something like that. I forgot exactly the issue, but it was, and it lasted for like 2 weeks. It was a huge protest, much bigger than the party was accustomed, especially in Hubei province, which used to be a very calm province and not usually a source of troubles. And then what a pure coincidence, suddenly COVID-19, and suddenly nobody is protesting because they're all afraid to cough. That was a nice coincidence, I'm sure. So yeah, again, but these things are possible in China because you still do have admittedly a thin consensus, but there is a consensus. There isn't one in Uganda because even the people who voted for Museveni, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want a great firewall. And now with him disrupting the online payments, I'm not sure that's going to be well received. And as it turns out, the internet is a complicated thing. You cannot just say, okay, we're going to lift restrictions on online payments, but keep them on WhatsApp. No, that's not how this works. And again, no country, even China doesn't have the infrastructure to sniff out packs in real time, so it can automatically decide, okay, this pack is from WhatsApp, so it gets blocked. This pack is from an online payment, domestic online payment, this one goes through.
Yeah, well, the capability exists, only that it will be economically so detrimental to impose such a thing because if you were to do packet sniffing, not to mention that you need a fuck ton of infrastructure, that was going to be very expensive, but inherently you're going to slow down the transfer speeds to that extent that it makes it pretty much inoperable. We're going to be back to dial-up era.
Yeah, and Uganda isn't particularly a fast internet country to begin with. Admittedly, it's nowhere near as slow as many people tend to imagine. It's pretty decent, actually. Now, of course, I'm not going to compare it with Romania because, by our standards, it's terrible. But if you compare it with Germany, it's not that bad. But even so, putting in nationwide package sniffing so you can block WhatsApp but allow mobile payment, because again, from the perspective of the analyst, you only see mobile traffic, desktop traffic, and the gray area. The gray area is people like me who sometimes use mobile apps via desktop because I don't own a smartphone because I'm not stupid, and of course people who use weird operating systems like I don't know, Tails or things like that. That's the gray area. So the gray area is the most difficult to tackle. But then you have mobile traffic. Well, good luck sniffing which one is WhatsApp and which one is an online payment. It's possible, of course. I think GCHQ in Britain has the capability, but the best they can do is offer up a demo for we can impose this on a neighborhood. And even there, on a neighborhood, is already incredibly complicated. Good luck imposing that on a country. It's just not doable. And again, techno-optimists from the intelligence community were 20 years ago saying, oh, within 20 years we're going to have the capability to do this for a whole country. It's just as far today as it was in 2000. It's just science fiction. It turns out that the economics tends to disagree. All right, since we spoke about the CCP quite a lot, Forbes, how the US should respond to genocide in Xinjiang. On the last day of the Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued a determination saying that genocide and crimes against humanity are taking place against Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in Xinjiang. The determination is an essential step towards ensuring justice for the more than 1 million Uyghurs currently held in political re-education facilities in China, for the Uyghur women being forcibly sterilized at the hands of their own government, and for Uyghur Americans with loved ones in China that haven't heard from in years. The late-hour atrocity determination is an encouragement to the Biden administration to stand by the voiceless facing atrocities in Xinjiang, as well as a charge to a divided U.S. Congress to unify over the need to help those who can't help themselves. Evidence has been mounting for genocides and crimes against humanity for quite some time. When reports first emerged in 2017 that Uyghurs were being collectivized and interned in political re-education camps in China, the world knew something terrible was taking place. As time went on, reports from inside Xinjiang became increasingly harrowing. One Jamestown Foundation report by Adrian Zenz found documented evidence that the CCP had a goal of forcibly sterilizing between 80 to 90% of Uyghur women and of childbearing age in certain provinces. Reports from Radio Free Asia documented Uyghur children being systematically separated from their families. The Congressional Executive Commission on China documented deaths and torture of people in the camps. The evidence illustrated the CCP's intent to commit genocide. On that basis, I urged the State Department to issue an atrocity determination in the September 2020 Heritage Foundation report, not as a standalone action, but as a critical step towards a strong response to human rights violations in Xinjiang. Atrocity determinations aren't a mere feel-good measures. They have historically led to follow-on action by Congress and the executive branch. After the Obama administration's ISIS genocide determination, Congress passed legislation that led U.S. aid to create the Genocide and Persecution Response Fund, a more than $389 million fund aimed at providing relief, get an editor, Forbes, to survivors of ISIS genocide. The fund was aimed at helping those left behind with the support they needed to rebuild lives broken by the atrocities they and their community faced at the hands of the Islamic State. Similar leadership is now needed, not merely to respond in the aftermath of a genocide and crimes against humanity, but to respond as they are occurring. The Trump administration took several important steps that preceded the issuance of the determination, including the sanctioning of Chen Chuanzhuo and other CCP leaders and entities responsible for carrying out these human rights violations. The administration has also prioritized stopping goods produced with forced labor in Xinjiang. We talked about that 4 episodes ago, I think. Orders of cotton, whatever we discussed that as it was happening. Next steps can and should include extending priority 2 refugee status to Uyghurs, continuing to combat and upping the ante on efforts to combat forced labor, and identifying additional individuals and entities in the CCP ripe for sanctioning. Today's atrocity determination should not be seen as an apex of policy achievements, but rather as a call to action for other countries to join the United States in responding to a crisis that will go down in history as among the West. This is an opportunity for U.S. leadership, demonstrating that we're not afraid to call a spade, and we're ready to protect and preserve the human rights of the Chinese people, even when their own government fails to do so. Now, admittedly, this reads like a blog post because it kind of is a blog post. It's an opinion piece, but it's an opinion piece from someone who knows what it's talking about and who's been consistently correct for over 6 or 7 years, even before Trump, during Obama times. Now, this will be I mean, of course, she's presenting it as let's just push through, let's unite the divided Congress and whatnot. I'm not that optimistic. And I'm not that optimistic because both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, there are quite big factions who are like, maybe we should flatten some of the entanglements. Now, admittedly, it's China, so it's a lot more of a bipartisan consensus. The Congress is more woke on the Chinese question than it was in 16 or 15 or even 17. So in that respect, it has a little bit more chances. But, determinations of atrocity and whatnot, okay, yeah, of course, it's true, but will that make much of a difference, as this Forbes author says?
Difficult to say because Mike Pompeo came out and called what happened in the Xinjiang province a genocide. which is a pretty serious accusation towards the CCP in particular. But in the end, the CCP will most likely shrug it off and just say, yeah, he just said that on his last day in the office.
Well, they did issue a personal sanction against Mike Pompeo. Yesterday, I think.
Yeah, like that's gonna solve anything.
I'm sure Mike Pompeo is very pissed off because he can't visit the Great Wall of China anymore. I'm sure Mike Pompeo can't sleep well tonight because he's personally sanctioned in the PRC.
Yeah, but taking up a fight on the topic of Xinjiang, it was pretty much the operating body of China, which is the CCP. Well, that's going to be pretty difficult. Of course, the US has already started the race. Now it's up to be observed who else will be joining. That's what's going to change if there's going to be a significant push from a bloc of nations to at least do something from the part of the CCP, then yeah, something will get changed. But based on what we've seen with other, indeed, much smaller scandals in the past, if you remember the Foxconn suicides, well, that didn't change anything regarding
the practices at Foxconn. Yeah.
Not only regarding practices of Foxconn, but of course nothing changed, because Foxconn is a pretty huge company, and not to mention they're also Taiwanese. They're not exactly Chinese. Well, but
and none of the Western companies subcontracting Foxconn, none of them really bothered. Yeah, sure, it was a hypocrisy scandal for Apple. They had to flatten a few contracts, but for the most part,
they did. But the best effect at that point would have been observed if the consumer perception changed, and actually say, look, we're going to boycott Apple-made products because they're made in factories where people can't jump off windows because Foxconn has put nets in order to prevent their suicide.
Yeah, and of course that didn't happen because Apple cultists are hypocritical as fuck, and were even more hypocritical then than they are now. I guess the topic wasn't ripe for this kind of case to be made in public at that time. Maybe it is more ripe now. I don't think so, but okay, maybe it is more ripe now. The reason I'm looking at very pessimistically to this particular route of approach is because I see it as too early. It's not that it's a bad idea. Yes, of course, it's one of the tools that should be used. It's a diplomatic tool that should be used to attempt to at least flatten some of the excesses in Xinjiang, because you're not going to stop it unless you're planning a full invasion. Let's get that out of the way. But I see it as too early, and I'm looking at previous scandals of the PRC flattening religious minorities. I'm thinking here of the Free Tibet movement, which benefited from a lot more institutional support and basically ended up nowhere. Or the mass protests in favor of the Falun Gong sect or cult or whatever you want to call it, religious group. I remember back in 2017 when I was in Göteborg, Sweden, I stumbled upon a group of Falun Gong protesters who were protesting in front of the Chinese consulate. And the protesters were very low energy, and you could see it up from a mile that they were paid to be there. It was just not, at the time it was still the peak. It was very fashionable and fancy to protest in favor of the Falun Gong and against the prosecution of the Falun Gong by the CCP. Now, admittedly, Falun Gong were not, from a propaganda perspective, they were not the perfect victims. Because if one were to read a little bit further about what Falun Gong actually means, it's very difficult to get the public empathy levels up. It's not that they're necessarily distasteful, but they're not exciting either, right? So it's very difficult to. Here again, at least some of the victims in Xinjiang are Muslims. It's not a particularly great period to foster pro-Muslim empathy, even though, as we know, and maybe others don't, the Muslims in what's historically called Uyghuristan are not exactly the same kind of Muslims you're imagining in the Islamic Republic of Iran or Saudi Arabia, or it's more like a Hanafi school of thought, more like Turkey rather than Saudi Arabia, right? So there's that. But even so, these kinds of nuances are complicated, and there's no way you can broadcast those to the public. The angle with the sterilization of women, at least from a propaganda perspective, I think that one
will have the most success.
Yeah. If I were now a propagandist at the CIA, that's the angle I would target. Because human nature tells us to give a shit about what happens to women. Historically speaking, no policy, not no policy, the vast majority of policies changed when they disproportionately affected women, or one could create the perception that those policies disproportionately affected women. So it doesn't even have to be true. You just have to convince the public that women are suffering under a certain policy. It doesn't matter what the policy is. If you can convince the public that women are suffering under it, the public will support a change. Now, in this case, you don't have to lie. The CCP is openly bragging about sterilizing women, and this dressing up that in very progressive rhetoric that even the progressives would be like, mate, come on, come on. I'm gonna look up the tweet and I'm gonna put it on the display so you can watch it. Basically, I think I put it on Facebook several times. They basically say that we're basically emancipating the Uyghur women. We're no longer being trapped as a child manufacturing and whatever, something like that. They use the rhetoric, and now they're just being given better education and whatnot, and they're happy and they were actually doing good too. But it was so forced that even the most die-hard progressives would be like, nah.
Yeah, they wouldn't swallow the bait.
Yeah, they just didn't take the bait.
But on this topic of Uyghur women, one thing that also has to be mentioned is the blatant double standard that the CCP is practicing. CCP already knew since they got rid of that idiotic Maoist one-child policy. They finally faced reality that the gender imbalance due to tradition, but also the Maoist measures, pretty much is going to send the Chinese society into the gutter in a few decades.
Yeah, it's so ripe for a revolution.
Yeah. So what's happening is that for pretty much a year after they trashed that policy, they began actively encouraging the Han Chinese to have more children, even as far as getting to threaten communities that if they don't produce more children, then they're going to artificially inseminate the rest of the women in the community. And then you get this where in Uyghuristan, because they're not Han Chinese and they're part of the undesirable minority, they go the exactly opposite way and go into sterilizing the vast majority of the female population.
They just they didn't even go full Maoist. They went full Maoist and beyond, because even Mao would tolerate one child, but then the modern CCP says no, for Uyghuristan Mao was too progressive. So it's going to be a very long, I think I made this remark before, but it bears repeating. It's going to be a very long propaganda dispute. Of course, this particular author is engaged in an effort to convince officials in both parties and whatnot. So of course, she's going to use this kind of dramatic language. Not that she's wrong, but it's obvious that it's written as a persuasion manifesto rather than a policy paper. And it says, the crisis will go down in history as among the worst. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But until you convince not just a significant portion, it doesn't have to be a majority, but until you convince a significant portion of, yes, the deep state, and a significant portion of the populace, of the civilian population, until you do that, nobody's gonna care. Nobody's gonna care.
A good PR stunt to do now is to get back Femen and protest in front of Chinese embassies.
I didn't think about that. Sure. I wonder what Ina Shevchenko has been up to lately.
Start with the Chinese embassy in London.
Or in Paris.
Because
Ina Shevchenko, I think she's already in Paris.
That's a good start. The Chinese embassy is in London or Paris.
Yeah, that would be an option. And basically get the whole, because the feminist activist apparatus has been left without a point to exist lately, because the feminist narrative is so bloody unpopular, even among the leftists. They're all sick and tired of it.
And the division within
their ranks. So they're just now in a limbo. What are we going to do? Because
we're gonna give them an axe to grind.
But give them an axe to grind. China man bad, Chinese patriarchy, something like that. I mean, for enough shekels, I can write the propaganda for you. It's not complicated because feminists are NPCs. They're gonna swallow it. But you use that infrastructure. But this should be acted pretty fast because 1 year from now the infrastructure will be disintegrated because they're all quite demoralized. Throughout 2021, just try to persuade them and use that infrastructure for anti-Chinese protests. And there's two advantages for that. One of them is, of course, if you can convince them to do this, they're going to do it with a zeal, and it's going to be pretty cheap. You don't have to pay them too much. And secondly, again, if you can project that it mostly affects women, you can drag the public opinion in favor of the topic, kicking and screaming, even if they don't give a shit generally.
Even if they don't give a shit about the persecution. If women are involved and it's about pretty much state eugenics.
And it would also be a legitimate case of reproductive rights being violated, as opposed to most of the bullshit reproductive rights cases that have been thrown out in Europe and North America lately. At least this one would be a legit case of reproductive rights being violated. Yeah, that could work. That could work. But again, unless the West, the empire, unless we start working with the propaganda campaign, because again, let's not forget that's how it happened in the previous Cold War. First, you convince the population, and you have to convince them. You cannot force them. You have to convince them, and this was true about China as well. By the way, they convinced their own population first. Sure, they had more methods to coerce it, but still, they had to convince a significant portion of the population. Same thing here. You have to convince a significant portion of the population to actively vote with their wallet against China and support these kinds of projects. I wouldn't call them movements, but projects to put Xinjiang situation closer to the public opinion. Admittedly, in this case, the press sort of helps. Almost weekly now, there is at least one article in a mainstream source about what's been happening lately in Xinjiang, and which was unheard of 4 years ago. I mentioned in the podcast, like in 2014, another podcast that I used to do, I mentioned once or twice about Xinjiang, and after the episode, I would get like 50 emails. What's Xinjiang? Right? Nowadays, at the very least, it's a little bit more mainstream, but still, there's a lot of work to do, and it could be done in 1 or 2 years. Admittedly, you can't save everybody. A lot more other people will suffer at the hands of the CCP, no matter what. But the total toll of suffering can be shrinked can be flattened.
Can be diminished.
Diminished, yes. If enough from the empire are willing to do the dirty work, because yes, this is the dirty work. We just openly said that we should manipulate feminists during the, and you don't have to manipulate them necessarily. You just have to forget.
You just have to throw them a bone.
Throw them a bone and forget to tell them that purpose. The purpose is to destroy socialism, right? You just have to forget to tell them that it's good for the empire and the Western patriarchy. That's basically what you have to forget to tell them. So yeah. And we were discussing before we started the cameras. Throughout Chinese history, every other 80 or 90 years, there is a spectacular implosion. And then there is a reform. Well, the CCP has been in power for 72, 73 years.
I think.
Yeah. So it's soon going to be 80. And usually after that period, well, after the spectacular implosion, then you have a period of mass poverty, like it happened during the Great Leap Forward. And then you have an uninterrupted period of spectacular growth, usually 30 to 45 years, kind of like now. And then a small period of crisis, and then a spectacular implosion. You are here, right? At the end of the spectacular increase, spectacular growth. So yeah, I'm just saying. The lessons of history, they tend to matter. We're going to talk a lot more about China, of course. Deutsche Welle. US imposes sanctions on China CNOOC oil company over South China Sea. The US government on Thursday slapped more sanctions on Chinese firms and military officials over Beijing sanctions in the South China Sea. At the center of the wide-ranging sanctions was China's state-owned oil company, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, which was added to a US Commerce Department blacklist forbidding business with US citizens. However, a US official said the sanctions do not target hydrocarbon exploration or joint ventures outside of the South China Sea. The US stands with Southeast Asian claimant states seeking to defend their sovereign rights and interests consistent with international law, says US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We'll continue to act until we see Beijing cease its coercive behavior in the South China Sea. Pompeo said the sanctions were directed against those responsible for or complicit in either the large-scale reclamation, construction or militarization of disputed outposts in the sea, or China's use of coercion against Southeast Asian claimants to inhibit their access to offshore resources in the South China Sea. The U.S. Commerce Department said this corporation has repeatedly harassed and threatened offshore oil and gas exploration and extraction in the South China Sea with the goal of driving up the political risk for interested foreign partners, including Vietnam. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said this corporation acts as the bully for the People's Liberation Army to intimidate China's neighbors. The Commerce Department's entity list requires firms to be granted a license before they can receive exports of high-tech items from U.S. suppliers. The Standard & Poor's Dow Jones said late Wednesday that it would delist the CNOOC on or before February the 1st, which is part of a wider campaign by the Trump administration to isolate Chinese firms from U.S. investors. Tech giants China Telecom, China Mobile and China Unicom were removed from trading as of Monday. The department also added Chinese aviation firm Scrizon to a military end-user list, which restricts its access to U.S. exports. None of the companies involved in Tuesday's sanctions immediately commented on the decision. Now, the question is whether the Bidianu-Robinet administration will continue this or not. Because even if he does nothing and just lets the deep state continue to do these kinds of things, because again, it's not, let's not kid ourselves, it's not the decision necessarily was not the decision by Trump or by Pompeo. It's already a deep state consensus, right? Yeah,
it's already a deep state consensus, and we've seen it earlier. We've covered it in one of the, in the first half of the so far episodes we've done. Already there was a bipartisan effort which has started just in the summer of last year to already sanction individuals and a few entities that were involved in suppressing the population of Hong Kong during the protests.
Also surprisingly ended by COVID-19. Terrible coincidence. Go ahead, sir.
And what ended up happening is that initially people thought that it was going to take 6 to 12 months in order for the deep state to move, but they managed to do it in a month and a half to get the sanctions ready and put a dozen people already on the public list, and it was pretty much everybody from the then chief leader of Hong Kong all the way to the main police officers and those part of the security apparatus that were involved in beating down the people on the street.
Yeah, and soon enough were to be the enforcers of the new security law. At the time, well, the security law has passed, and now they are the enforcers. But good luck getting paid, because now they're, isolated from the global financial system. Now, the thing is that if Biden does nothing, that's a good policy, because the deep state will kind of keep on taking care of these kinds of entities. I guess we'll soon find out whether the doomers were right or not. I suspect they weren't, but it's gonna be 5 to 8 weeks from now. We will know for sure who was right. In the sense that if he's indeed Beijing Biden, then we should expect something to the effect of trying to at least tame these sanctions or limit their reach or whatever. If nothing happens within the next 5 to 8 weeks, then probably he's maybe Shanghai Biden, not Beijing Biden, right? So in the sense that it's maybe just standard corruption rather than deep-seated political corruption. I guess the latter is the former is better, because corrupt politicians have been a thing since forever, and while it is terrible, it's not the end of the world. But if you have someone that is quite literally working for the enemy, then that's a problem. The Republic has survived FDR, who was great buddies with Stalin. So I'm just saying.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be interesting to be observed in the next few weeks. We're just gonna not care about most of the measures that Biden already implemented in his not even first day of office.
Yeah. Again, it seemed that most of the priorities of the first day in office, which let's not forget, it's a tradition in the United States, in the first day the president to sign 20 or 30 executive orders. He only signed like 17, so by historical norm he's pretty flattened. Well, of course he's tired.
Sleepy Joe.
He was already asleep during the inauguration, so there's that. But on a more serious note, the focus seemed to be on very marginal activist stuff that don't really impact geopolitics.
Yeah, out of that list, the one that needs to be observed pretty closely will be the renegotiation of the deal with Iran. That one stuck particularly because the rest were pretty much bullshit, like rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, stopping to build a wall, which didn't get to exactly built. They were just 450 miles.
Yes, and also, you can stop the push from the administration, but you cannot stop all of the actions of the renovation, which are done internally by ICE. And the Trump administration was smart enough to fill in ICE with Trumpists. So, good luck firing those people. Bureaucrats are impossible to fire. So, it's going to be a little bit more complicated. Oh, and of course, he launched the 100 days mask challenge, which actually only applies to
federal institutions.
Less than 1% of the US surface. But hey, he did, because if you remember, the propaganda in the campaign was like, oh, we're gonna ask all the Americans. And I was like, no, you can't do that. Well, of course we can. Yes, we can. No, you can't. Here you go, Bidano administration, the Robinet administration. Oh, actually, just these buildings, and because everywhere else.
Yeah, he's got no influence.
Yeah. And that's one of the beauties of the American system. It doesn't matter who wins the presidency. There's always ways for the common plebs to just not give a shit. It's very oftentimes it's not as thoroughly affected. All right, let's move to Oceania. Last episode we did not have an Oceania section because Well, because it was getting already too long. This one's getting too long anyway. But 9 News, Australia seeking urgent advice from Norway after Pfizer vaccine deaths. What? I heard nobody dies from vaccines. Oh, give me a break. The Australian government is urgently seeking advice from Norway after reports of up to 30 people have died after receiving the Pfizer corona vaccine. Actually 33 at the time of the recording. The vaccine was rolled out to the Scandinavian nations' elderly and people in nursing homes with serious underlying diseases. Oh. Norway's medical regulator says reports suggest common adverse reactions to mRNA vaccines, such as fever and nausea, may have contributed to a fatal outcome in some frail patients. Australia has an agreement to purchase 10 million doses of the Pfizer jab. We're proceeding with an abundance of caution, Health Minister Greg Hunt said. Infectious diseases specialist associate professor Sanyaya Senanayake told 9 News that vaccine deaths could be coincidental. This could just be coincidental, that you have people with chronic health problems who just succumb to their chronic illnesses rather than due to the vaccine itself, she said. Aged care residents and older Australians will be vaccinated in the first phase of the rollout. The Pfizer vaccine is expected to be approved in Australia by the end of the month, with a possible rollout in February. At this point, there's no change, but we'll follow the medical regulator's advice, Mr. Hunt said. The Therapeutic Goods Administration says it's working with European regulators to determine whether specific warnings about risks of vaccination in the very frail, elderly, or terminally ill should be applied to the Pfizer vaccine. The TGA has full authority and full empowerment to make whatever recommendations they believe, Mr. Hunt said. So... 95-year-olds catching this fluffy cough from Wuhan, they tend to die. And then assholes like me come in and said, you know what, 95-year-olds tend to die. And yes, when a cough like this hits, they're probably going to die. Oh, you're a criminal, you're a murderer, you want to kill granny, you wear a mask, stay indoors. And of course, the medical establishment, no, these people definitely died because of COVID-19. It couldn't possibly be any other of the rap sheet of diseases that those 95-year-olds were suffering from.
I remember the list that was published in Romania.
For the first cases.
With the first tens of deaths that were so-called associated to COVID, and there was one guy with terminal stage lung cancer, one guy that had pancreatic cancer, but kidney disease, stage 4 kidney disease, and all sorts of very nasty stuff. And the vast majority of them people over the age of 70.
Yes. In fact, I think it's either in Sweden or actually no, in Sweden and in Italy, the average age of people dying allegedly associated with COVID-19 is above the country's life expectancy. So yeah, when you notice these kinds of things, you're a murderer, you want to kill granny, yada yada yada. No, of course they all died because of COVID-19, so stay indoors, wear the muzzles, don't be a criminal. But then, the exact same thing happened because the law of big numbers happens with the vaccine. No, it's purely coincidental. No, of course the vaccine didn't kill them. Well, you know what? I agree. It's highly improbable that the vaccine killed them. But it's the same thing. People aged 80 and above, they tend to die because they tend, especially in nursing homes, they're already quite sick. And at some point they die. And if you vaccinate enough of them, but statistically speaking, it's impossible for it not to have a few of them. In Norway, there was like 40 deaths a day in those nursing homes. So 33 in several weeks dying after they took the vaccine. Yeah, it could be entirely coincidental. I agree. But at the same time, I'm less tolerant with that, even though it's probably the truth.
Actually, the Norwegians determined that out of those
33,
out of those 33, 13 or 14 of them were.
Could be. Even those are not. They're not entirely convinced. The reports are pretty contradictory. Let's say 14 are because of that, for the sake of the argument. Again, out of an average of 40 deaths per day, regardless of vaccination status. 14 in several weeks since the rollout of the first phase of the vaccination in Norway, it's probably either the same or lower than it would have happened if COVID-19 would have gone brrr in their institutions. All right? But I'm not willing to make the case for vaccination because y'all have been fucking hypocrites for an entire year, so I'm gonna say, no, the vaccine killed them. I know it's wrong, but you know, you lied in public for an entire year. Now it's my turn. And unlike the official propagandists of the government and the big vaccine, let's put that term there, big vaccine. Unlike them, I don't have to lie because there's always plausible deniability. People tend to forget that medicine and the medical field is not an entirely exact science. It's more than 3/4 is exact science, sure, but the rest of it is art. And what's the term in English? There be dragons. There's 75% is exact science, 15% is luck, art, whatever, and 10% is there be dragons. There be dragons. Yeah, not even that. There be dragons, because there's sometimes not even the basic rules of physics are being properly observed by certain patients. That is to say, they should be dead and they're not, or the other way around. They should have been able to live and they're dead. There's no way you can explain some of those things, and that's probably one of the reasons why you see so many deep religious believers within the medical establishment, because sometimes you witness certain aspects that are just impossible to explain. Now, it doesn't mean there is no explanation. It just means that we as a human race are still not smart enough to explain them, and that's okay. Admitting that there are things that you don't know, that's okay. That's one of the problems of the current year. We have too many experts who think that they know everything about everything, and then comes in that 10% of the there be dragons from the medical practice.
Yeah, and they start shitting themselves, like the Australians shut themselves when they heard about the vaccine-related deaths. This is the moment to do some speculation. Why did they shit themselves when they heard about this?
That's easy.
It's definitely because they've already gotten tired. They're probably seeing some signs that the population is no longer complying with the narrative imposed by the state. They've gotten sick of the lockdowns, and I fully believe them, considering how harsh they were.
They are not under lockdown now, but yes.
Yeah, but
they made China look like a democracy. Let's put it this way.
Pretty much, and the state pretty much bet all the chips on the vaccine working.
Yes, and there's also the institutional and bureaucratic bias. That is to say, the Australian government treated the COVID-19 crisis entirely on a narrative based on scientism, right? So the religion of science. They treated everything as if we, the experts, know everything about everything, and what we say, y'all plebs better follow, because what we say is the absolute truth, determined scientifically, and there's nothing outside of this truth, capital T, truth, right? So as a result, you all stay indoors. We're gonna send the military to shoot at you if you don't, because we know better and whatnot. And then, certain plebs, they're like, hold on a second, but the numbers don't really add up. And hold on a second, I have several friends who already caught it. Hold on, we have a lot of friends abroad where the government is less insane, and, they all caught it, and they cough, and they great sneeze forward, and that was pretty much it. And, is it really worth it? And, some people started asking questions. Now, Australia, being not exactly a democracy, you could flatten some of these things, but still, it's more of a democracy than China, so it's difficult to impose policies that make China look like a democracy in Australia for too long. Eventually, enough plebs be like, hold on a second, are you sure? Maybe you're not. Maybe you're wrong. And then you have the inevitable honks that occurred in Australia, like they put an entire metropolis under lockdown because two people coughed at a pizza joint, and as it turns out, those people actually didn't cough. And
but it wasn't even that one. The funniest one that I've read this week was that they discovered a racing pigeon that hailed from from the Western U.S. It
From
didn't.
Oregon or something.
It originated from Oregon. He did an 8,000-mile trip all the way to Australia, and then they planned, we're going to euthanize this because it broke quarantine rules.
Yeah.
Try to explain to Pigeon what good quarantine is, and the suspicion was that they may be carrying COVID.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it's really, really interesting, and I suspect that's why the authorities in Australia shut themselves when they heard about people dying after they have taken the vaccine. Because again, realistically speaking, it's very difficult to prove such thing. Maybe some of them are as a result of the vaccine. Probably most of them are not. It's just the law of big numbers. Let me know when you gather 50 deaths or even 10 deaths of middle-aged or younger people dying very soon after taking the vaccine in a country like Norway. Then I will be scared. But it's just not the case. I mean, in Romania, there have already been like 300,000, 400,000 people taking the vaccine, 0 deaths. But then again, we don't have nursing homes because our tradition says you care for your elderly at home. There are nursing homes in this country.
There are nursing homes, but by no means it's
nothing comparable to Scandinavia or to Australia, for that matter.
Scandinavia, Australia, pretty much.
Canada, yes, and some portions of the US, yes.
Speaking of the US,
New York?
No, Florida. How does it happen that in Florida, which is pretty much part of common culture, that it's the place that every boomer dreams of retiring, how does it happen that they didn't have mountains of bodies piling up on the streets?
No nursing homes, Republican governance.
There are nursing homes in Florida.
Yeah, but not as crowded and as big as in New York. That's one aspect. Second aspect, of course, Republican governance. Asking the elderly, look, you might die from this cough, so you might as well, be a little bit more careful for the next 2 months. Whereas everyone else, go out, go cough. Because that's basically what happened in practice. Now, sure, Mr. DeSantis didn't say this out loud because he wants to be reelected, but for the most part, that's exactly what happened. And the hospitals weren't overflown, and things weren't that bad. As Tom Woods liked to say, I recommend you to watch Tom Woods' show because he's a libertarian who really, really got pissed off at the COVID narrative, and his newsletter is so funny because he tracks every single propagandist and every single politician. It's like, guess who else changed his mind on COVID? It's very funny. Anyway, as I'm saying, in Australia they treated this as we, the experts, know best, and your plebs better follow because they're not citizens, they're subjects, and all the rest. But now they're like, okay, we're gonna bet everything on the vaccine. This is our way out, and it will be glorious. But then bloody Norwegians print news in English about
and somehow the news reached the country, which nobody can confirm that it really exists.
Yes. At the end of the day, Australia is just a conspiracy theory, of course. And birds are not real, so why are they bothering with that poor little pigeon? Anyway, what I'm saying is that the news broke quarantine rules. It entered Australia. And again, to give you an idea, because I was reading recently, because of course I was lazy to translate it into English, a few tennis players from Romania are now in Australia preparing for the Australian Open or something like that, and they're describing the quarantine rules, and again it makes China look like a democracy in comparison. So they treated it as with a view of, we're gonna eradicate the virus, which I guess you can do if you're an island. But for how long? Considering that it's a cough that, kind of never stops spreading. It's not, just like the Spanish flu never got eradicated, by the way. It's still here. I might having it now. I might be having it now. There's not much you can do. But they said, no, we can do it. Yes, we can, right? That's the mentality. Of the government, especially of the health authorities, right?
The revolutionary drive.
I guess it's not necessarily a revolutionary drive here, but more of this idea of experts knowing everything. And of course, it's very difficult to admit, especially for the people who actually believed in technocrats. I've always been skeptical of these. That's because I was already old enough to be politically aware when the first technocratic government arrived in Romania 25, 26 years ago, and got to see it firsthand what technocracy actually means. And I'm like, probably these people are terrible. And since then, I've always been skeptical when I hear, oh, but the tech people are... But most people have had a positive opinion of technocratic governance, and COVID-19 is the perfect example and the biggest fiasco of technocratic governance, right? Italy has done 100% of what technocrats like Fauci recommended. 100%. His own country, the United States, did not follow most of Fauci's predicaments and diktats and whatever. But Italy did. Everything Fauci said 2 days later was policy, mandatory policy in Italy. Everything by the book. And it didn't work.
Yeah, and Conte risked getting hung in a petrol station because of those policies.
Yes, and now the politicians, some of them are just trying to blame it on the experts. They say it wasn't me, it was the experts. Yeah, but you signed the decree. And,
yeah, you can't get away by not being accountable. Yeah, some of them will, but it's definitely hard. That only works in Soviet republics or
not necessarily
or people's republics where you can always blame on the tiny manager, the tiny engineer of being a rogue agent.
It's going to work in some democracies as well, but the problem is, and probably that's why certain governments in Europe, including our own, they're marching really, really fast on infrastructure, something else, something that is not COVID related, because when this shit hits the fan, because it will, it's just, slow motion train wreck, but when it will, they can say, oh, well, maybe we kind of fucked it up partially with COVID, but look, we did some shiny infrastructure, we did this, we did that, please don't shoot us, right? Same thing with Mr. Morrison, is going very, very hard on China and whatnot, a lot of good policy on other aspects, because if shit hits the fan in his own country with COVID-19, which it might, then he'll say, well, look, the Ministry of Health kind of sucked. Whatever, we're going to sack all of those people or, reshuffle the cabinet a little bit. But, meanwhile, I was busy with these kinds of things, which is my competence and whatnot. Please don't shoot me, right? But yeah, as for the vaccine itself, because I've gotten a few emails, well, should we take the vaccine? I don't know, your business. As someone who's had the disease already, I'm not in a rush to get vaccinated. Why should I? It's a waste of time.
Yeah, as someone who I never really checked because I didn't bother to do the antibody test. I might have probably had it. I'm not sure, but I'm definitely not going to get vaccinated.
Yeah, well, not yet anyway. I mean, if it's going to be 5 years from now, it's going to still be necessary. Yeah, sure. In 5 years, there's going to be enough of mountains of data to make a honest assessment on whether it is its risks are lower than the virus itself, which they might. In 5 years, there's plenty of time to get developed into such a version. If not, if 5 years from now everyone will have forgotten about this whole mess, then of course I won't, and you get the point. But yeah, in relation to especially to these countries that locked down really hard, like New Zealand and Australia, and a portion like New York State, Italy, places that went really, really bananas on this kind of on this virus. Their governments have only one shot. Both literally and figuratively. Well, actually, literally 2 shots, because you have to take another shot like 21 days later or whatever. That's their shot. That's their way out. And if they don't, if they fuck this one up, then there'll be dragons.
Yeah, their heads will be on the chopping block.
That's why, and we can see this better in Eastern Europe and in Israel, by the way. Let's accelerate it. Who cares if it works or not? Let's get as many of them as possible, and then just flatten the statistics. Okay, there you go. Problem solved, right? Because that's exactly how it's going to happen. I can definitely say this is going to happen in Israel. It's going to happen in our country. It's going to happen in Hungary. It's going to at least Eastern Europe. That's exactly how it's going to function. We're just going to say, okay, fine, we vaccinated 50% of the population, and with another 20% that have natural immunity, there you go, problem solved. Because, you know, the hospitality business, the industry, the tourism industry, the all of the events, whatever, all of those have to resume. There's no more money to prolong this nonsense, and as a result, you know, the pressure kind of mounts. So yeah, of course, in the meantime, there's going to be that scare with the vaccine passports and things of that nature, also of Australian origin, by the way. Qantas, I think they were the ones who launched that stupidity under public debate. Again, this is not new. It happened before in 2010. It was the same discussion, ended up all the way up to the European Commission and intergovernmental panels and whatever. By the time they figured out what to do, the pandemic itself had passed. I suspect it's going to be something similar, or if they get to implement it, it's going to last like 3 months, maybe this summer or whatever. And of course, there's going to be ways around it. There's always ways around it.
Or more like, in order to settle light once and forever regarding COVID vaccines, when these countries in the first quarter of 2021 will look at the economic data and see how much they lost, the last thing that they would want would be to keep people away from spending money especially foreigners, to spend money in their country, particularly countries that sort of rely on tourism more or less.
Italy, Morocco, New Zealand, Tunisia, Turkey, Uzbekistan actually opened up entirely since May, so fuck this shit. So yeah, I don't know, Guadeloupe is also opened, Thailand, there are many countries whose share of the GDP from foreign tourism is with two figures, usually starting with 2. Namibia, another example. There are plenty of these countries, and you know, these countries cannot afford.
And even if it's not even if the part of the GDP that's accounted for tourism is not in the double digits, the next economic crisis that's gonna come due to this psychosis, it'll be that hard, so that you wouldn't have exactly a choice when it's about where you get your money from. You're gonna end up in a point where you get any sort of money that you can get your hands on.
Yes, and the hospitality industry, even in countries where it doesn't represent a huge share of the GDP, it does represent a huge share of people employed in it. Like our own, you know, in our country, the hotels, restaurants, and coffee shops and whatnot, they're like 3 or 4% of the GDP, maybe 5. I don't think it is even 5. I think it's 3. But it employs
hundreds of thousands of people.
Hundreds of thousands of people. Do you want all those people, you know, coming in with the tiki torches in your government? I don't know. Maybe you do, because for now they've been able to keep them sort of happy by, you know, opening up here and there and giving them some compensatory payments and what. But yeah, but that's not going to work for much longer. A lot of them, their blood is boiling. They're like, I don't think we're going to handle this for too much longer. And at some point, you can get to the point of a critical mass, and then it's not good. Then there'll be dragons. In Italy, it's a lot worse than that. You know, 13, 14% of their GDP is the hospitality industry and tourism. Yeah, good luck keeping those people. Well, actually, they no longer even try. Most of the restaurants in Italy are now open. They're like, come in and issue fines at us. And of course, nobody comes. So yeah, I guess that's more people globally will learn to do things the Eastern European way. You know, they say something, the government says something on TV. In practice, we do as we please. The Eastern European way. Someone from Argentina was writing to us that, the lockdown in Argentina, I haven't heard about that for several weeks now. It's basically on paper, no one cares. Of course. That's another problem with trying to analyze epidemiological data and say, look, in Argentina, you know, they've been under the longest lockdown. Yeah, but how much longer was it? How
stringent was exactly the enforcement?
Well, it was at first, because I have not a friend, but someone that I know, I'm acquainted with, got stuck in Argentina at the beginning of the panic. And at the time it was relatively stringently enforced, but as months went on, Argentinians be like, you know what, let's cough. Alrighty, speaking of tourism and countries that have troubles with that, Radio New Zealand, domestic tourism spend not filling the $6 billion hole left by lack of international travelers. Tourism industry Aotearoa Chief Executive Chris Roberts says despite New Zealanders' efforts this summer, it just can't compare to what international tourists bring in. Who would have thought? He says last year international visitors spent over $3 billion in December and January. So that's effectively disappeared entirely. So while the domestic visitors spend, when we do get to the figures, might be up slightly, it's not going to go anywhere near replacing that $3 billion. International tourists will then go on to spend another $3 billion in February and March as New Zealanders return to work. A tourism campaign encouraged people to do something new in New Zealand to support the tourism sector, and while New Zealanders have flocked to the beaches and lakes, other regions are still doing it tough this summer. Golden Bay, the Abel Tasman region and the Tasman district have been especially busy. In Motueka, the Smoking Barrel restaurant, which sells slow-cooked American-style meats and is famous for their donuts, has broken all sales records. But Roberts said not all regions were seeing high visitor numbers. For some other parts of the country that have a heavier reliance on international visitors, they've been doing it hard, so the likes of Queenstown, Fiordland and the Westland have still struggled right through this Christmas-New Year period. Distance from main population centers was another factor. What we're seeing is those places within 2 or 3 hours drive of a main center have been doing well, but places a little bit further away are not attracting New Zealanders in significant numbers, and those are the ones that are struggling. Fox Glacier, Franz Josef Glacier and Te Anau are particularly hard hit. Totally Tourism offers scenic flights, glacier landings, heli-skiing and boat cruises in the Milford Sound, Queenstown and West Coast regions. Owner Mark Quickfell said that before COVID-19, 80 to 90% of his clients were from overseas, and while the domestic market had since grown, it was just not enough to make ends meet. A good example of that is with our helicopter operations, where last summer we were operating about 20 helicopters and we're now operating about 9, so less than half. We're treading water in the hope that either a bubble with Australia will occur or that the vaccine is distributed wide enough that we can get an air corridor into New Zealand, close quote. Or you could stop being hypochondriacs and get on with the great sneeze forward. I'm just saying. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh. But again, $3 billion. I haven't looked at because $3 billion sounds like a lot of money. But how much is that as a share of the New Zealand tourism industry? I presume it's quite a lot. They say 80 to 90% of the customers used to be foreigners. So, minus $3 billion may mean quite a lot.
It's not actually just minus $3 billion. I mean, minus $3 billion, as the article said, was just for
December and January.
Yeah, was just for a period of 2 months. But in New Zealand, you can do tourism all year round, even if it's winter. And there are quite a lot of people, particularly Australians and other countries from Asia that are going there to do skiing. So the actual total losses for the year for pretty much the year 2020 are around $8 billion, which if it doesn't sound like a lot, but in order to get an idea of what that means, the entire GDP of New Zealand, at least in 2019, was 284 billion. So that sum that they lost, which is $8 billion out of tourism, is around 4% of the GDP.
Yeah, that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot, especially with a small country like that.
A country of 5 million people again.
Yeah, that's quite a lot.
It's quite significant, and this is just happening out of one sector. What about the rest?
Yeah,
because tourism isn't just the sector itself. You also have all the other industries feeding tourism.
Yeah, the tourists have to eat. They have a place. They need a place to stay. They need cars. They need fuel. They need all sorts of things that are just not being bought. And of course, if tourists don't come in and rent a car and buy fuel, which is taxed by the New Zealand government, then that's further revenue loss that is, at least at the prima facie, at the first sight, doesn't seem to be related to tourism, but it is. Not to mention all of these traditional manufacturing places, small businesses that make traditional objects, whatever, are being sold mostly to tourists. Again, all of those had to be either shut down or significantly shrinked by, how many people would order traditional New Zealand art, handmade art, online and wait for 3 months for it to be delivered using the New Zealand post office. Really?
Not only wait 3 months, but also have to pay taxes on it.
Yes. Yes. I don't know.
Well, New Zealand pretty terrible start for 2021. What I can say.
Yeah, and just like I'm the kind of person that in the winter time I try to go to places like Cyprus or Egypt or whatever, places that are warmer. Then there's the opposite type of people. When it's summer in the northern hemisphere, they're heading straight to New Zealand or Australia or even South Africa, places where it's cold. The fans of the winter, right? If you like to travel, you can have your favorite season all year round. In 2018, I did like that. Because I really hated the winter between 17 and 18. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East and Cyprus, and just to avoid the goddamn cold. So yeah, that's why I kind of hated this year, because it's pretty damn cold outside. And you're gonna lose all of those. And again, when we were saying this 3 months ago, we were like, well, maybe it's not so bad. Remember, the finance minister from New Zealand came in and said, well, it was a loss, but it's not. It's better than we expected, and it's only 5% or whatever. And I'm like, probably
yeah,
not.
for 5%. Yeah, it's gonna be 5%, but you've already started the new year with -4.
Yes, and. At some point, even this guy from Total Tourism or whatever it's called, Totally Tourism, is that, but maybe we can get distributed the vaccine wide enough so we can get an air corridor into New Zealand. Yeah, good luck with that, especially with European countries, all of them sucking at logistics. So because I've seen some certain governments, including our own, they started, but the anti-vaxxer man bad. Guys, you can't get the jab to all of the people who want it immediately. You can't serve those. So, until we get to the discussion of whether anti-vaxxers have any influence on anything, first of all, let's get served those who really want it. And let's see if the discussion about anti-vaxxers is even worth having it to begin with. Because again, with the exception of Israel, everyone borked it up with the logistics. France being the top tier borker. Yeah, and it's quite funny because France has been pouring ungodly amounts of money into medical infrastructure over the last 20 or 30 years. And, the big leftists who are big fans of big government and big fans of universal healthcare, they always say, look, France is doing great because they're the only ones not cutting funding from public healthcare and whatnot. Fine. Then comes in the real challenge. Let's vaccinate the entire population or whatever, 70%. With this kind of thing. We spent a lot of money, so we should surely have the logistics. Oops, nope. Nope. Meanwhile, countries that didn't really give a shit about their healthcare service, like our own, actually they go brr. It's actually much better in terms of raw numbers.
Yeah, because in Romania you have what some countries in not just particularly in Western Europe, don't have private healthcare.
Oh yes.
Oh boy.
That's the moment I'm expecting, really. I mean, the state to just authorize private vaccination centers where you just pay. I'm sure there will be plenty of people willing to pay. That would drive up the vaccination effort quite fast, and before you know it, all of those who want it have already gotten it. And then we can have the conversation about vaccine passports and anti-vaxxers and all that. I'm sure the pandemic will just pass on its own. You know, most respiratory pandemics last for between 18 to 24 months. There hasn't been one that lasted more than 24 months, really. It doesn't matter what measures you take. They always last somewhere within this range. So, you know, 18 months would be roughly August or September this year. And the way the graphs are looking, it's probably going to be somewhere around there. So, you know, better hurry up with that vaccination effort, because otherwise none of you is getting your money back on your investments. I'm just saying. As for these tourism peeps, in a way I pity them, especially those in New Zealand who did nothing wrong. Those in our country, I don't pity them because they licked the boot of sanitary fascism, so I'm glad to celebrate their bankruptcy. But those in New Zealand probably did nothing wrong, and you know, geography doesn't help them either. Even if they wanted to disobey the state's orders, how would you do that
How would you do that, and what exactly would be the return on your risk investment of disobeying the state? Well, flights were shut down. Australia went full mental disorder. Who are you going to rely on? Pitcairn Islands, or rely or rely on Fiji?
Which Fiji has nicer landscapes and it's much cheaper. So, you know, if I have to choose between going to New Zealand and Fiji, Fiji.
Yeah, true, but the issue is flying there. Flying's pretty fucking expensive, and you got to fly from either Australia or New Zealand. Yeah, there.
That's true. Still, it's a nicer place. I'm just saying.
No doubt about
that. But what I was about to say is that at least in countries of Europe, because almost all of them, at some point the operators in tourism be like, you know what, we're gonna just break their regulations. For instance, in May, technically speaking, nobody was allowed to do tourism in Romania in May. I went to visit a friend in a place around Brașov, and let's not be clear here. 100% of the villages around Brașov are tourist villages, all of them, right? And it was very difficult to find a place in a pension, in a rustic hotel. They were all full. And not full with domestic tourists. There were a lot of Israeli tourists, British tourists. And again, officially, they were all shut down.
Yeah, I personally don't blame them. Particularly the British.
Yes.
I've seen firsthand what happened in Britain during that period.
Yeah, and most of the British tourists were not. Usually the British tourists are, those are younger ones who tend to drink a lot and be noisy. This time around, that surprised me a lot. Most of the tourists were basically boomers. We're like, mate, we're kind of sick and tired of all the pandemic lockdown and bollocks. So we just came around here because in the middle of the fucking mountains in Romania, nobody's gonna look for us. And they had a point. Nobody cared that they were there. Yeah, technically speaking, they were breaking COVID-19 regulations, but someone would have to see it, and someone would have to file a report for it. And who would? Because every other house in the village was also housing foreign tourists. So, yeah, but at least in Europe you can afford to do that because
you got options.
You got options, and
New Zealand doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
And also, it's very hard to keep a tight border. Ceausescu tried, didn't work. Even Ceausescu was unable, and even though the security had the opportunity and the permission to shoot to kill if you disagreed with not crossing the border.
Yeah, so I personally know one guy who served as border guard on the border with former Yugoslavia.
Oh yeah, especially that particular border.
Yeah, it's exactly the one that was the most sought after.
Yes,
because Yugoslavia didn't go full retard on the communism.
Yeah, and once you got into Yugoslavia, all you have to do is to say that you request asylum to the West, and then you would spend time in a refugee center for 90 days, so Mr. Tito can get his shekels from the UN. And then after those 90 days, a very nice car from the Communist Party would drive you to your favorite embassy of your favorite country with the paperwork already filled in for you, so you don't have to work too hard. And there you go. And if you are lucky, the same day you would be in the plane off to Italy, and then from there anywhere you wanted. So there's that. But what I'm saying is that it wasn't possible then. It's very difficult now with in the context of the European Union and whatnot. And even so, with Romania, at least you have a hard border with Hungary because they're in the Schengen area and we're not. But good luck inside the Schengen area. Recently, I think Mrs. Merkel or Jens Spahn, the health Führer, they were saying, "Oh, but we're going to close the border if our neighbors don't adopt measures for COVID-19." And how are you going to close the German border? Like really, how? It neighbors 7 countries, 7 or 8, and all of them in the Schengen area. How are you going to close the border exactly? Oh, you're going to put police filters on every road? Fine, I'll walk past it.
Well, which are they? France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Poland is the 6th, Austria, Czech Republic, that's already 8.
And that's it, because Liechtenstein is not...
and Switzerland.
Yeah, but Switzerland and Liechtenstein are not in the Schengen area, because I was thinking specifically in the Schengen area. Denmark is in the Schengen. Switzerland and Liechtenstein are not. Although Liechtenstein is de facto in the Schengen area because there isn't a hard border between Liechtenstein and Germany. So there you go. Yeah, good luck shutting down the German border for COVID-19 reasons. I'm sure that's going to work. We didn't know. Right. But again, New Zealand doesn't have these options. So I can't blame them for being eager to see the vaccine distributed more. Unfortunately for them, there's a long wait coming. Maybe, next summer. By New Zealand standards, so that'll be November 2021. By that time, nobody will care about the vaccine, I suspect, unless we're really unlucky and this pandemic is more towards the 24 months instead of the minimum of 18. But even then, by next summer it will be fine. So with that said, I guess we're done for now. Kind reminder to give shekeling.
Please, we told you a lot of stories, at least make them worth your time.
Yeah, and the hand that requires shekels without telling a story doesn't get shekels. We told you 4 hours of stories. Can we get a shekel for it? And with that said, see you around quite soon. Cheers.